Hello everyone. Today we will learn about another case. The case of Joanna Yates. Joanna Yates was born on April 19, 1985, in the United Kingdom. Her friends and family called her Jo. She was the younger of two children, with an older brother. Joanna enjoyed a happy childhood in a loving home, as her parents were relatively wealthy and sent her to a private school. After graduating, she attended the Peter Simons College, where she studied landscape design and earned a diploma. This education helped her become a skilled professional in a field she had always dreamed of working in. By the end of 2010, at 25 years old, Joanna was thriving in her career. During this period, she was in a relationship with Greg Reardon, who was 27. Greg and Joanna had met in December 2008. Both Joanna and Greg were dedicated young professionals who prioritized achieving financial stability before considering marriage and children. In October 2010, Joanna received a job offer that marked a turning point in her life. With her solid professional qualifications, she was hired as a landscape designer at a promising company in Bristol. Everything seemed to align perfectly, allowing her to begin building her future. They started renting a ground-floor apartment in a private house in the city that same month. They quickly focused on their work. Joanna was known for her positivity, cheerfulness, and energy. With Christmas approaching, they excitedly prepared to celebrate in their new home. They decorated their apartment and bought gifts for their families, looking forward to the holiday. However, no one could have anticipated that this year's celebration would be marred by unexpected events. On the evening of December 17, 2010, Joanna was enjoying a drink with friends. Around 8 p.m., she left the pub to go home. She walked through the city center and stopped at a supermarket but didn't find anything she liked. So she went to another store where she bought 2 bottles of cider. After that, she entered Tesco Express and purchased a pizza. With her essentials in hand, Joanna headed to her apartment, arriving at 8:50 p.m. Once home, she turned on the oven to reheat the pizza while texting several colleagues about her evening plans. According to her colleagues, Joanna planned to spend the rest of the day alone since Greg was away for the entire weekend visiting relatives in another city. She shared with them her feelings of sadness about being alone, mentioned that she would keep herself busy with Christmas preparations, and planned to bake pies to share with her colleagues after the weekend. Greg returned home on Sunday afternoon, December 19, expecting to see Joanna, but she was not there. He found her handbag, keys, and other belongings that she usually kept at home. He also discovered her winter coat. When he called her, he only found her phone lying in the living room, which worried him the most because Joanna had left without her mobile phone. According to all information, Joanna should have been at home and not at work. Even if she had gone shopping or visiting someone, it was strange that she left without her coat, phone, and keys. Something didn't add up. He noticed that the cat hadn't been fed for a long time. It was clearly very hungry and practically lunged at the food. Greg suddenly realized that something must have happened to his girlfriend during the 2 days he had spent in another city. While he was away, Greg had repeatedly called and texted Joanna, but she ignored him. At first, he thought it might be due to network problem, but now he knows things are not that simple. He remembered that 2 days ago, Joanna was supposed to go to the pub with her colleagues. And since then, he hadn't heard from her. He reached out to her parents, friends, and colleagues, but no one knew where she was. That night, feeling frustrated and worried, Greg decided to go to the police station to report his girlfriend missing. Given the time that had passed, the police took the situation very seriously and quickly considered the possibility of abduction. They searched Joanna and Greg's apartment, but found no signs of violence or forced entry. It seemed that Joanna knew her abductor and had let him in willingly. It was likely that she had been attacked in the apartment. During the investigation, they found a receipt showing that Joanna had purchased pizza and 2 bottles of cider on the evening of December 17. One of the cider bottles was open, suggesting she had taken a few sips before something occurred. However, neither the pizza box nor the food itself was found. If Joanna had been attacked immediately with the intent to abduct her, or something worse, it was improbable that she would have had time to eat an entire pizza and throw away the box. Joanna had clearly gone missing, and it was concerning that she hadn't opened her advent calendar on December 17 and 18, even though she had been doing so every evening prior. On December 21, her boyfriend and family appeared on television, pleading for anyone with information about Joanna to come forward. Following this, news of her disappearance spread rapidly across the country. During this time, authorities focused on Joanna's close circle, particularly her boyfriend Greg, who had been away and could have used that as an alibi. However, he quickly proved he was with relatives in another city, clearing him as a suspect. Additionally, all signs indicated that their relationship was healthy, with no apparent motive for anyone to harm her. The police interviewed the tenants living on the first floor, which had 2 rented apartments, while the landlord lived on the second floor. They also questioned the landlord, who insisted he had not heard anything that evening and had not seen Joanna. The tenants on the first floor were a couple, Vincent Tabak, an engineer, and his girlfriend Tanya, an analyst. They were a respectable couple planning to marry soon. They mentioned that they did not know their neighbors well since they had only recently moved in and had not met them yet. On the night in question, Tanya was attending a corporate party, and Vincent picked her up at 2 a.m. He did not notice anything unusual that night. They had hosted a loud party on December 1 with music and heavy conversation. During the evening, they heard some loud female screams, but all the young partygoers were drunk and did not pay much attention. As the sounds quickly faded, it was unclear where they originated. However, they now thought those screams might be connected to their missing neighbor. At first, everyone was hopeful that Joanna would come home safely. However, as the days went by, their confidence began to fade. On December 25, 2010, a young couple was walking their dogs about 5 kilometers from Joanna's apartment in a remote area on the city's outskirts. They noticed something unusual sticking out from the snow by the roadside and thought it looked like clothing. Curious, they decided to investigate further and uncovered the body of a girl. They immediately contacted the police, and it was quickly confirmed that the deceased was 25-year-old Joanna, who had been missing since that weekend. Heavy snowfall had covered her body, which is why it had remained undiscovered for a week. Forensic experts who examined the scene quickly observed that the body was not only covered in snow, but also intentionally concealed under leaves and branches. This suggested that Joanna was not just a random victim of an accident. It appeared she had been deliberately hidden there. She was found wearing the same clothes she had on Friday evening, except for her coat, which was left in her apartment. Her t-shirt was raised, exposing her right breast, which could be related to the motive behind the attack. Although she was wearing warm socks, one sock was missing and could not be located. The police speculated that the absence of the sock might indicate that the killer took it as a trophy, a behavior sometimes seen in maniacs and serial offenders. A forensic examination revealed that the cause of death was asphyxiation. In addition to neck injuries, 43 other wounds were found on her body, including abrasions, deep scratches, and bruises from blunt force trauma. This evidence indicated that the victim had fought desperately for her life. Because she was discovered in the snow during cold weather, her body had not decomposed and remained in good condition. Notably, Joanna was found lying in a fetal position, suggesting that she had been intentionally placed there. The examination also showed that she had not eaten the pizza, indicating that she was attacked before she had the chance to do so. Interestingly, just a meter away from her body, blood was found on a concrete barrier, which was identified as belonging to Joanna. It appears that the killer initially intended to move her body over the barrier, but was unable to do so for some reason. This suggests that Joanna was killed in one location and that an attempt was made to hide her elsewhere. It also seemed that the perpetrator or perpetrators were startled and had to flee quickly. During the examination of Joanna's clothing, traces of semen from a man, likely the attacker, were discovered on her jeans, particularly near the zipper, indicating an abuse assault. As it became evident that the crime was particularly brutal, a large-scale operation was launched to locate the suspect. This investigation was set to be one of the largest ever undertaken by the police in this part of the UK, involving around 60 officers. They reached out to the public for assistance, initially offering a reward of £10,000 for information leading to the capture of the suspect, which was later raised to £60,000. Joanna's friends created a website and used social media to support the investigation. Meanwhile, detectives focused on examining Joanna's immediate social circle, looking for any potential enemies. Described as non-confrontational and mild-mannered, she had no known conflicts with anyone. The investigators gathered video footage from surveillance cameras located on the Clifton Suspension Bridge, which Joanna crossed on her way home from the pub, where she was last seen alive. Upon reviewing the footage, they found it to be of poor quality, yielding no suspicious activity. The detectives also considered the possibility that the suspect might have taken a different route over another bridge across the River Avon, situated a kilometer from Joanna's home, which could have avoided detection by the cameras. However, this theory remained unconfirmed. A man named Christopher Jeffries was the landlord of the apartment rented by Joanna. He had previously been a teacher but retired and now made his living from rental properties. People described him as quiet, very intelligent, and somewhat eccentric. Before these events, no one suspected he could be involved in anything serious. His unusual behavior was never perceived as a threat. The police spoke to Christopher again about the night of December 17. He stated that he went to the gym to work out that evening and returned to his apartment around 9 p.m., not leaving again afterward. This timing matched when Joanna was believed to have come home. Christopher insisted that he did not see or hear anything suspicious that night and did not hear any of the female screams reported by party attendees. His alibi was weak because he lived alone, with no one to support his claim. However, concerns grew due to the inconsistencies in his story when he spoke with detectives again. He suddenly mentioned seeing a few unfamiliar young men near Joanna's home just before her return, describing them as suspicious. He could not see them clearly, and this addition to his story was met with great skepticism. Joanna's landlord became the primary suspect. Distrust intensified when Greg informed the police that Mr. Christopher had helped him jump-start his car on the morning of December 17, just before he left town. Greg clearly recalled saying he was leaving for the weekend and was worried about his girlfriend being alone. Naturally, a perpetrator might have seen this as a convenient opportunity to attack. The police had not yet confirmed their suspicions, but somehow journalists discovered that Christopher Jeffries was the main suspect. Reporters began to chase him in the streets, forcing Christopher to stay home almost all the time to avoid them. The situation deteriorated further when various rumors about him started appearing in the newspapers. He expressed that he was close to a nervous breakdown and felt unsafe. Whenever he went outside, he was openly called a criminal, with fabricated stories about child abuse during his teaching career. On December 30, 2010, the police arrested Christopher and subjected him to harsh interrogation. Despite this, he firmly maintained that he had no involvement in the murder. At that point, authorities did not have enough evidence to charge him in court. However, later, Vincent, another tenant living in Mr. Christopher's house, came to the police station. He suddenly remembered that on the night of the incident, he had left the house twice and saw the landlord's car parked in the driveway both times, first in the early evening and again later when he went out to find his girlfriend. Vincent noted that the car was facing the opposite direction the second time, suggesting it had been driven somewhere that night, which contradicted Christopher's claim that he hadn't gone anywhere. During the search of Christopher's apartment, police discovered a pair of sneakers with small stains that looked like blood. These items were sent to the lab for testing, but the analysis would take time. Under UK law, police can only hold a suspect for 24 hours if there is not enough evidence to make an arrest. After one day, they must either release the suspect or go to court to request more time for custody. In this case, the police chose to extend Christopher's detention because they needed more time to analyze the evidence and formally document witness Vincent's statement. Despite the extension, the police could not establish Christopher's involvement in the crime. The stains on the sneakers were too small to obtain a DNA profile with the technology available at that time. After testing, the lab returned the sneakers, stating that it was impossible to extract DNA or determine the source of the stains. Even so, this did not lead to Christopher's release. The male DNA found on Joanna's body and clothing did not match his profile. On January 1, 2011, during a holiday, Christopher was released without charges, which was a relief for him. However, the media continued to pursue him. The investigation had a promising lead in Vincent Tabak, who altered information in his testimony. He had no alibi at the time of the crime, making him a new suspect. The police believed he might have tried to frame the landlord in an attempt to mislead the investigation. Suspicion towards Vincent grew stronger after he called the police station to explain how Christopher's car had moved while he was in the Netherlands. It was puzzling why Vincent hadn't mentioned this detail earlier. To obtain an official statement from him, several police officers visited him on December 31, 2010. During the questioning, they noticed that Vincent acted strangely. He was vague in some parts of his story, but gave very detailed answers in others, almost as if he had rehearsed them. These inconsistencies raised red flags for the experienced officers, who noticed that he was carefully considering his answers and managing the information he shared. The most suspicious detail was the unexplained scratches on his hands. He insisted he didn't know Joanna at all, claiming he had only moved into the apartment a week before the incident. When asked to provide fingerprints and DNA samples, he hesitated and explained that he had been in the neighboring apartment with the landlord while Joanna was away, which might have accidentally left his DNA. Vincent took a long time to agree to provide the samples for comparison. His profile showed a partial match with the DNA found on the body of Joanna, but there was a significant issue. A quality DNA sample from Joanna could not be obtained because she had been lying by the roadside in the snow for a week, which exposed her body to the elements. As a result, the samples were badly damaged and contaminated, meaning that even a partial match with Vincent could not definitively prove he was the murderer. Nonetheless, this information raised serious suspicions in the police investigation, prompting the authorities to investigate Vincent's background more thoroughly. Vincent Tabak was born on February 10, 1978. At the time of Joanna's murder, he was 32 years old. He was originally from the Netherlands and was the youngest of 5 children. As a child, Vincent was quiet and shy, more introverted than many of his peers, but he was also very intelligent and ambitious. In 2003, he graduated from a technological university in the Netherlands with a master's degree in landscape design, a field he shared with Joanna and hoped to pursue further. In 2007, Vincent moved to the United Kingdom and began working as an engineer. That same year, he met Tanya, and they later moved to Bristol, renting an apartment in the house of Christopher. The landlord had a positive impression of him, as Vincent was calm, friendly, and had no criminal record, which convinced Christopher to provide him with housing. On January 20, 2011, 32-year-old Vincent Tabak was arrested on suspicion of murder. He consistently denied his guilt and maintained his original story. However, during multiple meetings with detectives, he repeatedly changed his statements, adding new details. Initially, he claimed he had stayed home that evening until leaving to pick up his girlfriend Tanya at 2 a.m. Later, he claimed that he had actually left the house twice that night to take photographs and go to the supermarket. Vincent was insistent only in his statement that he did not kill Joanna. It became clear that he was lying and trying to evade responsibility. The police identified the car Vincent was driving and scrutinized footage from street surveillance cameras to track the routes the murderer might have taken when disposing of the victim. Detectives were not surprised to find Vincent's car appearing along nearly the entire route. The car was seized and examined. Numerous pink fibers, matching those found on Joanna's clothing, were discovered in the trunk. These fibers were mixed with fibers from Vincent's own clothing. The most significant evidence found by forensic specialists was blood stains in the trunk. Testing revealed that this blood also belonged to Joanna. It was clear that the perpetrator had attempted to clean the car of any evidence. There was a strong smell of cleaning products, but he had not done a thorough job. Detectives confiscated Vincent's laptop and mobile phone for examination. The analysis showed that his attack had been driven by abuse desire from the start. The laptop contained numerous images and videos, along with browser searches for depraved content. Vincent preferred methods such as strangulation and beatings, which aligned with how Joanna was murdered. He was also a regular visitor to escort websites and met escort in person. It came to light that Vincent was living a double life. He appeared to be a decent man and Tanya's fiancé, while privately, he harbored dark secrets. After the murder, a large number of search queries were discovered that revealed Vincent was looking for information about Joanna. He was closely monitoring the investigation, and detectives observed a troubling detail. After checking the progress regarding Joanna's death, Vincent seemed to take pleasure in reliving his actions. This behavior indicated that he could be a potential serial killer, likely to kill again once the thrill of his past victim faded. The investigation uncovered incriminating evidence, including searches related to murder and the decomposition of human bodies. On January 22, 2011, Vincent Tabak was charged with first-degree murder. Although he initially denied his involvement, he later confessed, but insisted that he never intended to kill Joanna. He claimed his actions were accidental and not premeditated. In October 2011, hearings commenced. However, the judge prohibited the prosecution from using the defendant's obsession with violent and abuse content as evidence. In court, Vincent chose to represent himself and delivered his final statement. He recounted that on the evening of December 17, 2010, he was alone in his apartment since his girlfriend had gone to a Christmas party with her colleagues. When he returned from the store, he noticed his neighbor, Joanna, waving at him from her window and inviting him inside. Once inside, Joanna offered him some cider. Vincent misinterpreted her welcoming gesture and believed it indicated a desire for intimacy, which led him to kiss her suddenly. Joanna reacted immediately by screaming and pushing him away. In a state of panic, Vincent covered her mouth and wrapped his hands around her neck in an attempt to silence her. He claimed he held his hand on her neck for about 20 seconds before realizing that Joanna was no longer alive. Vincent insisted that there was no abuse motive behind his actions, viewing it merely as a misunderstanding and a tragic accident. In court, the defendant pretended to feel remorse, but it seemed insincere. The prosecution argued that his version of events was just another lie, especially since it did not account for the 43 injuries the victim had sustained. Joanna even had a broken nose, which suggested a lengthy struggle and significant force. The prosecution believed that the 20 seconds of strangulation he described was far too short. They thought he had been observing her for a long time and intentionally entered her apartment that night when he knew she would be alone, likely after overhearing a conversation between Greg and Christopher. It appeared that Vincent had long-standing feelings for Joanna and knew her better than he let on. He had initially intended to abuse and kill her, as shown by his fetishes for strangling women. Being a strong young man, he easily overpowered Joanna, who was 30 centimeters shorter than him, and he used his full weight against her during the struggle. She sustained injuries to her head, neck, torso, and arms, indicating that the fight was drawn out, and her death was slow and painful. He continued to put himself in a compromising situation after the crime by taking the victim's pizza. This is the only reason why neither the pizza box nor its contents were found, even though the receipt was found in the apartment. It's possible that blood or his fingerprints were on the box, prompting him to throw it away along with the food. At 9:25 p.m., Vincent texted his girlfriend Tanya, claiming he was bored at home without her. This was an obvious attempt to create an alibi while he was far from bored at that moment. After sending the message, Vincent loaded the victim's body into his car trunk, stopped at a store to buy beer and chips, and then drove to a different location to dispose of the body. The prosecution reiterated to the jury that Vincent Tabak was a dangerous criminal who could not be trusted. On October 26, 2011, during the closing arguments, the jury began their deliberations, which lasted for 2 full days. On October 28, they returned with a verdict, finding Vincent Tabak guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 20 years. However, his legal troubles did not end there. In March 2015, he was charged with possessing child abuse. With 145 illegal images found on his laptop, he pleaded guilty once more and received an additional 10-month sentence. Following Vincent's conviction, Christopher Jeffries sought justice for the damages he had incurred. He filed defamation claims against several newspapers for harming his reputation. These publications, which had published 8 articles about the case, eventually apologized to Christopher. As a result, they were ordered to pay significant financial compensation for the reputational and moral damages caused. In 2014, ITV releasing a 2-part series titled The Lost Honor of Christopher Jeffries. This series focuses on the former teacher who was affected by the murder of a girl who had rented an apartment from him. Hello everyone, today we will learn about another case. The case of Elizabeth Espino Vasquez. Elizabeth Vasquez Marin was born in a city located in the Cajamarca department of Peru. Her parents were 6 children. The parents loved them all dearly and worked incredibly hard to raise their children in prosperity. Elizabeth's childhood was happy and cheerful, as is often the case in a family with many children. She got along well with her 5 siblings. During her university studies, Elizabeth met a young man, Alejandro Espino, whom she married in 1987. A year later, they had their first and only daughter, whom they named Elizabeth Espino Vasquez, affectionately called Alida by everyone. By that time, both Alida's parents were balancing family life with their careers. Elizabeth began to develop her career as a lawyer, studying 2 majors simultaneously at university in Lima, while her husband was also working toward his career as a lawyer. Years later, his career advancement led him to the position of prosecutor in the fight against corruption. The hectic pace of life left them with almost no time to care for their little girl, who, during the first 4 years of her life, was raised by her grandparents on her mother's side. They provided her with the love that her parents could not, and additionally, Alida grandparents' youngest daughter was Alida's age, allowing them to grow up like sisters. Every birthday of Alida's was celebrated like a grand holiday and served as a wonderful reason for the whole family to gather. At every family event, Alida was always by her aunt's side. The 2 girls constantly played pranks together and were never scolded. Instead, they were spoiled and had their wishes fulfilled, which led to them being jokingly labeled as spoiled. When Alida turned 4, her parents decided, in her best interests, to move to the Lima department since it was time for her to start kindergarten and they wanted her to have access to quality education from an early age. Moreover, moving to the capital afforded Alida other privileges. To make up for the time she could not spend with her only daughter, her mother showered Alida with various gifts, leading her to live like a queen. She had the best toys, designer clothes, trips abroad, and a top-notch education. Additionally, Maureen indulged all her whims. Despite this, the little girl often felt out of place, unable to rely on her mother's company, who was busy managing several businesses. Nevertheless, Maureen tried to spend all her free time with Alida. Eventually, they grew so close that they resembled best friends. Unfortunately, this closeness vanished without a trace when Alida reached her teenage years. In an instant, she transformed into a problematic teen, and the first warning sign was her plummeting school performance, despite having always been the best student. Shortly thereafter, constant quarrels with her mother ensued. Alida's resentment began to fester because everyone around her admired her mother, specifically, her mother's success at work, beauty, and gentle demeanor. Alida did not possess the same physical attributes as her mother, which consumed her with strong jealousy. At every opportunity, she would question why she looked so different from her mother. In an attempt to reconnect with her daughter, Elizabeth continued to indulge her desires and shower her with gifts. Among these requests were plastic surgeries and other measures aimed at enhancing Alida's beauty. Elizabeth supported and financed these efforts in hopes that Alida's confidence and self-esteem would improve, but the girl remained unsatisfied. Her hatred for her mother only deepened. Elizabeth and Alejandro's divorce in 2007 only exacerbated the situation. Alida blamed her mother for it all, and her resentment intensified. Around the same time, Alida began dating a young man named Fernando González Asenjo, whom she met at a Mormon church in the San Isidro area. Few people knew that Fernando attended the church solely to exploit unsuspecting young believers with considerable money. His scheme was simple. He would tell wealthy young women that his family was very poor, that he lived alone with his mother, and that his father had abandoned the family when he was just a small boy. By pretending to be a good son, a victim, he evoked pity from the girls and gained their affection. Alida was no exception. In reality, Fernando was a problematic individual. He had no job, didn't even try to study, wanted an easy life. Fernando understood that Alida would easily succumb to manipulation and would support him, while Alida did not realize that Fernando was simply using her. When Elizabeth found out that her daughter was dating a young man from the church, she was happy because she thought he was a hardworking and good boy. Additionally, when Alida talked about the difficulties that Fernando had allegedly faced, Elizabeth decided to help him get his life on track. She rented him an inexpensive apartment so that he could live away from his mother and paid for his schooling, during which he was supposed to study business so that later, Maureen could offer him a job in one of her companies. However, Fernando did not take advantage of this opportunity and attended only 2 classes. When Elizabeth learned about this, she was very upset. Understanding that Fernando was dear to her daughter, she decided to give him another chance and offered him a job as a manager's assistant. Fernando missed that opportunity as well. He was fired after losing a check for a substantial amount of money, even though he was simply supposed to deliver it from one place to another. Furthermore, Fernando did not pay Elizabeth rent for the apartment, despite their agreement that she would let him live there for a minimum price, not for free. This behavior convinced Elizabeth that he was with Alida only for her money. She forbade her daughter from continuing the relationship, thinking she could break them apart. Maureen decided to send Alida to the United States for a vacation at her younger sister's house, with whom Alida had been very close in childhood. This decision turned out to be perfect. She hoped her daughter could meet other boys and forget about Fernando. Ultimately, this plan did not work, and the couple continued their long-distance relationship. Just a couple of months later, Alida returned to Lima to start studying at the law school of the Peruvian University of Applied Sciences. At the same time, Fernando moved to another apartment and began living alone, but he was able to afford this not because he found a job, but because Alida was paying all his bills. She received this money from her mother, who gave her about $450 a month for her university expenses. This amount, of course, was not enough for the lavish lifestyle Fernando hoped for. Therefore, to please her boyfriend, Alida snuck into her mother's room and stole her wallet. Elizabeth soon noticed the missing money, which led to a fierce argument between mother and daughter. Alida denied taking the money, but by that time, Elizabeth suspected that her daughter was still seeing Fernando, and the situation with the money helped confirm this. Intending to find out the truth, Elizabeth checked her daughter's computer. She found her correspondence with Fernando. In the messages, she also saw that Fernando was demanding rent payments, meals from expensive restaurants, and branded clothing from Alida. This situation was the last straw for Elizabeth. In turn, Alida interpreted this as a declaration of war. By July 2009, Elizabeth reduced the amount of money she gave her daughter for expenses and began to keep track of every penny she spent. Of course, all of this drove Alida to despair, as she could no longer indulge her boyfriend's desires. Alida's dissatisfaction grew. She wanted money, power, and freedom. She planned to achieve this at any cost, even ignoring the fact that Elizabeth was doing all of this for her sake. It was then that Alida decided to cross all boundaries and began to devise a plan to get rid of her own mother. Alida's plan was to inherit her mother's fortune, which was estimated at $4 million at that time. Additionally, Elizabeth had investments in the insurance market, owned several companies, and had several insurance policies, which Alida did not suspect. Little did she know that her mother was one step ahead in her efforts to protect her daughter from Fernando. She had rewritten her will, and in the event of her death, all her assets would go to Elizabeth's father, who would be obliged to take care of Alida. As if foreseeing what was about to happen, Elizabeth met with her parents, brothers, and sisters to inform them of her decision. She told them she was doing this for Alida, because she feared for her safety and her daughter's safety, having realized that Fernando was an unreliable person capable of causing harm for his own desires. Unfortunately, Maureen was not mistaken. While Elizabeth was doing everything possible for Alida's well-being, she was unhappy that Elizabeth did not accept her relationship with Fernando, and that Elizabeth had taken away some privileges. Alida planned to stage a kidnapping to escape with her boyfriend and use the money obtained to gain the freedom she so desperately wanted. Greed, envy, beauty, constant quarrels, the thirst for money, and Fernando's bad influence led Alida to devise a plan to murder her mother. Enlisting the help of her boyfriend Fernando and a friend of Fernando's named Jorge Cornejo Ruiz, who was 22 years old, to help them commit the crime that was to take place on the night of January 26, 2010. On that day, Alida went to work with Elizabeth and asked her for about $3 supposedly to print some university assignments. In fact, she spent that money to take a taxi home, let Fernando and his friend into their house. The guys hid in Elizabeth's room and were to wait for her return from work. Alida told them that when Elizabeth entered the room, they should immediately strangle Elizabeth as they had previously agreed. After talking to her accomplices, Alida returned to work with Elizabeth. Eventually, Alida and Elizabeth returned home around 10:30 p.m. Alida deliberately made a small noise so that Fernando and Jorge could hear. Unsuspecting, Elizabeth went up to her room and turned on the light. At that moment, Fernando, standing behind her, began to strangle Elizabeth while his accomplice Jorge held Elizabeth by her legs. Elizabeth managed to break free for a moment and resist, but Fernando quickly regained his footing, subdued her. When it was over, Alida went to the kitchen where the 19-year-old maid, Maria Liliana Huaman Chucolin, was at the time. She ordered Maria to go to her room and lock herself in there. After that, Alida returned to Elizabeth's room. While Fernando and Jorge held her down, Alida lunged at Elizabeth, began demanding money from her, forcing her to give the password to the accounts or hand over the safe's key. Until that moment, Elizabeth thought that Fernando was acting alone to take revenge on her, but upon seeing that her daughter was involved in the attack, she gathered her strength to lunge at Alida. Elizabeth managed to grab Alida by her arms and scratch her chest. When the fight was almost over, Elizabeth kicked her daughter several times in the legs. This last act enraged Alida, after which she struck her mother severely, pressed a pillow to her face to suffocate her. When Elizabeth stopped breathing, the criminals proceeded with their plan. Fernando and Jorge took the body, moved it to the trunk of Elizabeth's car. Meanwhile, Alida went to distract the guard. She talked to him and asked him to go to the pharmacy to buy some medicine. Thus, they managed to remove the body. They planned to hide it and the car to stage everything as if it were a kidnapping. The screams and sounds of the struggle were heard by the maid, which scared her greatly, but she could do nothing to help Elizabeth as Alida had locked her in and she had no way to escape the room on her own. Early in the morning at 5 a.m., Maria woke up and made orange juice for Elizabeth as she always did. At that time, Alida appeared and told her to drink the juice because her mother had already gone to work. After that, she went to her mother's workplace, where Elizabeth's accountant was already present. Alida told her that the criminals had contacted her and claimed that Elizabeth had been kidnapped. Elizabeth's accountant immediately blocked all of her boss's bank accounts to prevent the criminals from carrying out bank transfers. Jessica also noticed that Alida looked worried, that there were bruises on her arms and legs, but she did not pay much attention to it as at that moment she was only thinking about Elizabeth. She immediately reported the kidnapping to law enforcement while Alida called her relatives to tell them what had happened. When she returned to the office, she was shocked by the state of her workspace. There was chaos everywhere and many documents were scattered across the desk. At that moment, she did not notice that several important documents, including a will that Elizabeth claimed had been made a few months earlier, were missing. This will then caused a legal dispute between her relatives. While the police began investigating the disappearance from the tourist area, a horrifying message came in. An abandoned car had been found with a lifeless body inside. The body was taken to the morgue, where forensic experts conducted analyses and immediately established the cause of death as suffocation, discovering traces of violence on various parts of her body. The news of Elizabeth's death shocked her family and those around her. Everyone who knew and loved her could not believe that such a hard-working and kind woman could have been killed in such a terrible way. At the funeral, Alida appeared to be grief-stricken and inconsolable. In the following days, she displayed only cold behavior and a vacant gaze, as though she were not at all affected by her mother's death. Furthermore, she provided nonsensical explanations for what had happened that day. Her grandmother and grandfather felt that they no longer knew the girl they had raised, loved so much in her childhood. The investigation began by examining threats that Elizabeth's ex-husband had received a few months prior. He was a talented lawyer and at that time worked as a prosecutor fighting corruption. Investigators speculated that a possible reason for the disappearance could have been his significant role in the arrest of the mafia and a well-known banned substance dealer. He had powerful enemies, and their involvement seemed obvious, but the investigation in that direction led nowhere. The detectives assigned to the case then decided to focus on a person who could have been the organizer of the crime. By that time, enough evidence and conflicting witness statements had been gathered, indicating that the perpetrator could have been Alida, Elizabeth's only daughter. Despite her display of mourning at the funeral, the police had lingering suspicions, as during the interrogations, Alida provided contradictory stories. During her first interrogation, she stated that she had come home late in the evening and immediately gone to her room to study. At 2 a.m., she realized she was hungry and went down to the kitchen. When she returned, the door to her mother's room was locked, but the light was still on inside. Alida recounted that her mother had left for work early on the morning of January 27th, after which she received a call from the criminals informing her that her mother had been taken hostage and that they would release her in exchange for a ransom. Detectives managed to establish that this call never occurred. Instead, they discovered that on that day, Alida had made numerous calls to Fernando. Following this finding, they became the primary suspects in the case. When Alida was called back for questioning, she claimed that she had never argued with her mother, a statement confirmed by her father, who at the time was already a district judge and the chairman of the Supreme Court of Amazonas. He stated that their family was very close, even despite the divorce, and insisted that the reason for Elizabeth's death was revenge from her enemies, although this version had already been dismissed by authorities. Additionally, there was other evidence against Alida and Fernando. Although the criminals had wiped the fingerprints, a luminol test revealed that Elizabeth's blood had been found throughout the house. A crucial element in the investigation was the testimony of the maid, who described that terrible night, noting that she heard Elizabeth's cries for help but could not assist her because Alida had locked her in. She added that in the morning, she performed her household duties, but Alida came and said that her mother had already left for work. There is also the testimony of the guard. Later, Elizabeth's best friend testified that mother and daughter often had intense arguments, and sometimes Alida even attacked her mother. Considering all the gathered evidence and testimonies, on February 9th, the Homicide Investigation Department of the National Police of Peru appealed to the on-duty judge for the preliminary arrest of 3 suspects in this crime. Alida was arrested around noon. Just a couple of hours later, her accomplices, Fernando and Jorge, were also apprehended. During Alida's arrest, she was accompanied by her father, Alejandro Espino, and 2 defense attorneys. After Alida was placed in custody, she underwent a forensic examination, during which it was determined that she had injuries on her hands and feet that had occurred up to 10 days prior, around the time of the crime. After intensive interrogations, the first to admit responsibility was Fernando, followed by Jorge. Consequently, Alida felt she had no choice but to confess her guilt as well. Alida revealed that on the night of the maid, she distracted the guard, allowing her accomplices to break into Elizabeth's room. Furthermore, she stated that she cleaned up the crime scene and that it was Fernando who took Elizabeth's life. Alida did not conceal her motives, stating that she acted out of frustration with the imposed rules and the prohibitions on seeing her boyfriend. Meanwhile, the head of the forensic department emphasized the composure of the criminals, who confessed to committing their actions fully aware of the consequences and without being under the influence of alcohol or illegal substances. The criminals also revealed that they had planned to take Elizabeth's life several months prior when her relationship with Alida became unbearable. However, this was not the only motive. Another goal was to collect a life insurance policy worth $100,000. As new details of the case emerged and were covered in the media, public sentiment towards Alida deteriorated day by day, peaking when it became known that she was the one who initiated the crime that led to her mother's death. However, Alida's grandfather decided to visit his granddaughter in prison, hoping to hug and forgive her, as she was his blood. To his surprise, during one of these visits, Alida began to behave coldly towards him, insulting him, even telling him not to return. This occurred in March, 2 months after Elizabeth's death. Following this, he stated that Alida was now dead to him and immediately filed a lawsuit to exclude her from the inheritance due to her unworthy behavior, intending to prevent Alida from receiving her mother's inheritance. Consequently, a legal battle over the inheritance began between Alida and her family. Despite Elizabeth's relatives assuring that there was a will in favor of Alida's grandfather, this document, as previously mentioned, mysteriously disappeared from Elizabeth's office and from the city registrar's office. The accountant who worked with Elizabeth noted that the only person with access to Elizabeth's documents was her own daughter. By May of that same year, Alida initiated the process of the will from prison in an attempt to inherit her mother's estate, but she was unaware that she was not the only heir. Alejandro also filed a lawsuit, claiming that he and Elizabeth were not divorced but had merely decided to live separately and, in his opinion, he had the right to receive half of the estate as her widower. Liliana Vasquez Marin asserted that her sister and Alejandro divorced in 2007 with mutual consent and that both already had new partners. Alejandro's response was swift. He confirmed that they had indeed begun the divorce process but never finalized it, as they were concerned about their daughter and thought that finalizing the divorce might significantly impact her. Amid this inheritance dispute, another brother of Elizabeth intervened to assert that when they were handling the funeral, Alejandro was only interested in money. Additionally, he emphasized that it was too suspicious that 2 key documents in this case, the divorce certificate and the will in which his sister bequeathed all her property to their father, had gone missing. He also reported that Alida's father, taking advantage of his position and influence as a lawyer, publicly stated that his daughter would be sentenced to only 8 years in prison and would be released on parole after 3 years. Faced with these issues, the family lawyer provided the court with an executive document recognizing a foreign judgment, which stated that Elizabeth had divorced in the United States by mutual consent and that this document was valid in Peru. Over the next several months, Alida attempted to launch a campaign against her grandfather, choosing to slander him. She even dared to claim that he and one of her uncles were responsible for Elizabeth's death. The family was easily able to debunk these statements, asserting that Alida did this solely to harm her grandfather. Disappointment and grief gradually took a toll on his health and well-being, leading to his demise on December 27, 2011. He suffered a heart attack that resulted in his death. His remains were buried at the Kamphof Cemetery in Wapi, alongside those of his daughter, Elizabeth. After Alida's grandfather's death, the Vasquez family increased the number of lawsuits Alida to eliminate the possibility of them inheriting wealth. In the midst of the battles for inheritance, a lawsuit was simultaneously ongoing against Alida and her two accomplices for the death of Elizabeth. The first court hearing was scheduled for April 12 and was to take place in the 3rd Criminal Chamber for prisoners. However, the hearing was postponed until the 24th of that month after the court denied Alejandro's request to participate as a civil party in the process. When the time finally arrived for the first hearing, the suspects appeared in court dressed in black, with black nails, black pants, and a purple blouse. Alida attempted to appear calm, but her facade crumbled as soon as Ivan Melgar, the senior assistant prosecutor from the 9th prosecution of Lima, began mentioning more than 15 witnesses who would be called during the proceedings. Among these witnesses were Elizabeth's maid and the suspects, who were asked to testify about their state of mind the day before the crime was committed. The prosecution requested a repeated psychiatric evaluation for Alida after her defense requested to declare her innocent on the grounds that she had been suffering from bipolar disorder since 2007. During the debates, the deputy chief prosecutor officially filed for 30 years of imprisonment for her and the two other defendants, in addition to a payment of $27,000 as damages in civil proceedings. After the prosecution presented evidence, she pleaded not guilty and refused to claim any early dismissal or sentencing. On May 14, 2012, Fernando González Asenjo was sentenced to 28 years of imprisonment, and a week later, on May 21, Jorge Cornejo Ruiz received a similar sentence. While testifying, Alida accusing her former partner and his friend of planning, carrying out the attack on her mother. She also insisted that they had been hired by her uncle, who allegedly had connections to the illegal banned substance trade. This statement was supported by her father, who stated that the real criminals had exploited his daughter's mental illness to cause Elizabeth's death. Neither the victim's family nor the public believed this assertion. The trial took an unexpected turn when Fernando testified in court. During his testimony, he stated that he and Jorge had decided to commit the crime after Alida invited them to her home on January 26, 2010. Faced with this unexpected situation, the prosecution noted that Fernando's testimony contradicted his earlier statements made during the investigative phase, where he had claimed that he, Jorge, and Fernando had jointly planned the crime. Now, he had retracted his words. Given the circumstances, the prosecution announced that a confrontation would take place among the three suspects, mandated Jorge and Fernando to testify in court as witnesses. Eventually, Jorge provided testimony that Alida had offered him $20,000 not to speak about the events of that fateful night. Details also emerged regarding a plan devised by Fernando, in which the criminal group was supposed to go missing along with her mother, but Jorge asserted that he did not agree to be part of this plan. The Jorge's lawyer noted that it was established that his client did not participate in either planning the events that led to Elizabeth's death or in carrying out the attack. Ultimately, Alida made a shocking statement, saying that she did not regret that Fernando killed her mother, claiming she had clearly seen it and did not want to take responsibility for what he did. The lawyer also assured that Fernando's statements were spontaneous and that he had received no bribes to change his original statement. The maid, Maria Liliana, also noted that Elizabeth was against her daughter's relationship with Fernando because Elizabeth considered him a slacker. She reiterated her previous statements regarding Alida's confession and Alejandro's threats. After these testimonies, the prosecution and oversight body requested a copy of her statements to initiate an investigation against Senior Judge Alejandro in connection with the alleged threats he made toward Maria. At the time the appeal was initiated, the court granted Alita's request to recognize her as the heir to her deceased grandfather's estate. This caused outrage in the Vasquez family, who filed an appeal against the aforementioned ruling. According to the family's lawyer, it was proven that the accused was involved in the events that led to her mother's death, and that was sufficient to strip her of any chance of inheriting property from their family. Even greater uncertainty in the judicial proceedings was introduced by 4 experts tasked with establishing the psychological profile of Alita. As they reached contradictory conclusions, 2 stated that she actually had bipolar disorder affecting her ability to think clearly, while the other 2 declared that the disorder altered her emotional capabilities but not her consciousness. Consequently, she was very well aware and understood what she was doing, and she was fully responsible for her actions. One of the psychologists provided the court with drawings by Alita and printed statistics indicating that she had an above-average IQ, which suggested that she could manipulate others. Based on the results of the psychological testing, the prosecution claimed that the bipolar disorder referred to by Alita's defense was not an illness but an emotional disorder. Therefore, she should be deemed sane and receive a strict punishment. At one of the final hearings, expert testimony was presented by the specialist who examined Elizabeth. He reported that the bloodstains found in Elizabeth's car suggested that she may have still been alive when she was placed there. During his closing arguments, the senior assistant prosecutor stated that at the time of the crime, the accused was not suffering from bipolar disorder, was stable, and most likely had carefully planned everything in advance. After countless attempts by Alita, Elizabeth Espino Vasquez, to distort what happened and deny the truth, on December 24, 2012, she was found guilty of murdering her mother, Elizabeth Vasquez Marin, and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. While the judge read the sentence, she pulled out an icon and, with tears in her eyes, began to pray, tearfully declaring that the sentence was unfair. For several minutes, she spoke with her lawyer, who stated that he would appeal the verdict. The lawyer continued to insist that various clinical and psychological analyses conducted by renowned specialists showed that Alita suffered from an emotional affective disorder, and this should be taken into account during the review of the sentence. By that time, Alita was still listed as a potential heir to her grandfather's and mother's estates, was therefore continuing to process the necessary documentation to inherit them. In light of this, the Vasquez family demanded that the Fifth World Court make a ruling on the matter, as the procedure had been halted in 2011. However, over the next 8 years, all attempts by the Vasquez family to obtain a judicial decision on this matter were unsuccessful. On January 21, 2021, Alita received news of her father Alejandro's death from natural causes. To this day, legal proceedings regarding whether the Vasquez family can exclude Alita from the list of heirs are ongoing. The entire Vasquez family has stated that this situation has been a true torment for them. This case shook all of Peru, revealing that there are people who, in pursuit of their goals, do not hesitate to eliminate anyone who stands in their way, even their own mother. Hello friends. Welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Bill Mowbray. Bill Mowbray lived in Brownsville, Texas, USA, in 1987. He was a decent and loving man who was married to Susie. This was his second marriage. From his first marriage, Bill had a daughter named Christine, who lived with her mother. When Susie met Bill, she was also divorced and had brought her 2 children to live with them. Over the past 9 years, they have built a happy family together. They were only 4 years apart in age and shared many things in common. Despite Susie's eccentric personality, Bill thought of her as the ideal wife. Bill was dedicated not only to his family but also to his career. After attending college, he began working in car sales and eventually transformed into a prominent businessman. By 1987, he had successfully managed Mal Motors, a Cadillac dealership in Brownsville, for 13 years. Susie actively supported his work, often visiting the dealership and even appearing in commercials broadcast across the city. Their success brought them considerable wealth, making them local celebrities regularly seen on TV. The family enjoyed traveling and owned a large mansion in Brownsville, 2 beachfront villas, and several luxury cars. On the surface, their life appeared enviable, but in reality, it was far less glamorous. In recent years, Bill's business had struggled, with the dealership stagnating and showing no signs of growth. Bill realized he was sinking deeper into debt because his expenses far exceeded his income. Despite facing financial difficulties, they upheld an image of wealth and continued to spend lavishly. As their money problems worsened, it became evident they were facing a serious financial crisis. By 1987, the situation had also severely impacted Bill's mental health. He began suffering from depression and often voiced that ending his own life might be the only way to escape their predicament. For Susie, this was an extremely difficult time. Her husband had never spoken or behaved this way before, and she feared he might do something drastic. His relatives were equally concerned for his well-being. They arranged consultations with a psychotherapist in the hopes of helping him, but their efforts yielded little progress. Bill remained firm in his belief that their family urgently needed money, otherwise, the business would collapse, leaving them on the verge of poverty. A solution to their financial struggles seemed nowhere in sight. Facing the threat of bankruptcy, Susie and Bill ultimately believed their best hope lay in securing a new loan from the bank. On September 15, 1987, Susie, 39, and Bill, 43, called to wish Susie's son a happy 16th birthday. At the time, her son and daughter were visiting their father. The conversation was warm and enjoyable, and everything seemed normal. Later that evening, Susie and Bill watched a TV show together before heading to bed. In the early hours of the morning, around 2:15 a.m., Susie woke up to the terrifying scene of her husband holding a weapon pointed at his own head. Before she could react, he pulled the trigger, using his right hand while lying on his side. Shocked and terrified, Susie called out to him, but he didn't respond. Blood rapidly soaked the bed, and with mounting horror, she realized the gravity of his injury. Panicked, she rushed to the home phone to seek help but accidentally dialed the number of her work partner, Bill Luke Roy, instead of emergency services. Susie told Luke what had happened and confessed she didn't know what to do. Luke immediately urged her to call 911. She followed the advice and called the emergency services. However, she had already lost precious minutes, which forced the ambulance to set off immediately. When the ambulance crew arrived at the scene, they found Susie outside the house, standing calmly with a cigarette in one hand and a drink in the other. Showing no signs of distress, she led the paramedics inside and gestured toward the bedroom without entering it. Inside, Bill was lying on the bed, still alive but in critical condition. He was rushed to the hospital, where he later passed away. The cause of death was clear: a weapon injury to the head. Beside him lay a weapon in a pool of blood. Initially, investigators suspected that he had harmed himself, but they decided to carry out a more thorough investigation before reaching any conclusions. Forensic experts began analyzing the scene. The unusually large volume of blood warranted a detailed investigation. Blood spatters were found on much of the furniture, on the wall near the bed, and even on the ceiling fan. Fortunately, a blood spatter expert was brought in to assist. The expert confirmed that Bill had died from a single wound to the head. The only fingerprints found on the weapon during testing were Bill's. Susie has consistently maintained her perspective on the story since the beginning, asserting that Bill suffered from prolonged depression, had a tendency to harm himself, and had expressed these thoughts to multiple people on several occasions. Some of her statements were corroborated by her relatives and friends, as well as Bill's. Bill, a businessman, had been facing mounting challenges in managing his dealership, which seemed to have worsened his mental health. However, Susie's behavior raised significant doubts. She does not seem to be a grieving widow. Instead, she discusses her husband's death calmly, as though it were merely a trivial matter. Still, this wasn't the primary reason investigators began to scrutinize her further. The most shocking detail emerged in the 12 hours following Bill's death. During this time, Jim, Bill's brother, arrived at Bill's residence intending to speak with Susie, offer her support, and try to piece together what had happened by observing the scene. To his surprise, when Jim went upstairs, he heard music and the laughter of women. When he knocked, Susie came out casually and explained that she was hosting a party with friends. Jim found her behavior to be deeply inappropriate and upsetting. Later, Jim became one of Susie's most vocal critics as she desperately tried to prove her innocence. It was discovered that the women attending the gathering had removed all the furniture and carpeting from the bedroom. Not only were they listening to music and socializing, but the most alarming revelation was that they had repainted the bedroom a different color. Police viewed these actions as obvious attempts to interfere with evidence. Despite these suspicious actions, the blood expert successfully reconstructed the sequence of the incident. It is now clear that the case had nothing to do with Bill's self-harm. Detectives became convinced that Susie was the one who had pulled the trigger. Based on evidence collected on the first day, there appeared to be little doubt remaining. The focus then shifted to the remaining pieces of furniture and the nightgown Susie had been wearing. After thorough analysis, the expert concluded that Bill had been murdered by his wife, who had attacked him in the head while he was asleep. Susie was shocked when accused and immediately sought legal help by hiring a lawyer. The financial difficulties in their family's marriage have been confirmed by multiple sources. Susie said that Bill's unsuccessful attempt to obtain a bank loan led him to harm himself. Bill's family was aware of his dire financial situation, but not everyone believed that Susie was completely innocent. Detectives interviewed a loan officer at the bank who had interacted with Bill. The officer recounted how Bill had visited the bank in a deeply distraught state, even breaking down in tears. Bill reportedly stated that, without approval for a $200,000 loan, he would die. Unfortunately, Bill's financial situation was bleak, and his loan application was rejected. The loan officer had no choice but to turn him down. Numerous witnesses attested to Bill's desperation and emotional turmoil. Despite this evidence of Bill's deteriorating mental health, suspicions about Susie remained strong. Her behavior following her husband's death was widely perceived as celebratory rather than mournful. This interpretation led to widespread public condemnation and further distrust of her character. However, her lawyer firmly maintained her innocence. Bill Mowbray, a businessman, applied for a bank loan to keep his business running and pay off existing debts. However, the bank's refusal devastated him. That evening, he returned home deeply distressed and barely interacted with anyone. Susie did her best to console him, but her efforts did little to ease his despair. In the final days of his life, Bill fell into a severe depression as he desperately searched for a solution to his financial crisis. Later, Susie shared that after this incident, Bill frequently spoke about ending his life. She tried to support him by accompanying him to a psychotherapist. The lawyer worked to find evidence that substantiated Susie's claims, and succeeded. Several of Bill's longtime friends revealed that, approximately a decade before the tragedy, Bill had attempted to end his life. This had occurred in the 1970s, before Susie and Bill married, which explained why Susie had never mentioned it. After meeting Susie, his life seemed to improve, and those close to him believed that his past struggles had been overcome. This information further reinforces the narrative that Bill has a history of self-harm. The defense attorney believed this evidence would strongly support Susie if the case went to trial. He dismissed the notion that Susie was implicated in the crime by the gathering at their house following the tragedy. Furthermore, he argued that the prosecution's case relied solely on circumstantial evidence, which could be easily challenged. Susie's unusual behavior was not enough to indicate that she might resort to violence. Bill's family, however, argued that Susie's actions demonstrated a complete lack of empathy toward him. Meanwhile, an outraged Jim demanded justice for Bill and insisted that the killer be held responsible. Investigators suspect that someone else may have been involved in the crime and are questioning the circumstances surrounding the incident. Specifically, they were puzzled why Bill chose to end his life while lying next to his wife in bed. Typically, individuals who wish to end their lives tend to prefer doing so in solitude. If Bill were to choose to end his own life, He would have two methods to consider, either keeping a loaded weapon nearby, such as placing it by his bed or under his pillow, or waking up in the middle of the night, retrieving the weapon, and returning to bed before using it. Susie claimed she didn't notice Bill getting up at night, though it's possible she simply didn't wake up. She mentioned that she had once handled her husband's weapon after discovering it under the pillow. She explained that he kept it in the bedroom for self-defense, adding that such behavior was typical among Texans. Detectives, however, questioned why there were no fingerprints on the weapon if Susie had truly picked it up. Susie claimed that Bill regularly cleaned and wiped the weapon, but investigators remained skeptical. They began scrutinizing the dynamics of Susie's and Bill's relationship. During the inquiry, they discovered that she had multiple extramarital affairs during her marriage, and, importantly, Bill was aware of them. After numerous acts of infidelity, she and her children had left him and moved to Austin. However, Bill eventually persuaded her to return, and they resumed living together. Despite this reconciliation, many believed the relationship remained deeply strained. Susie and Bill were preparing for a divorce and discussing how to divide their assets, which created significant tension and might have given her a motive to murder her husband. Susie's behavior following the incident raised further suspicions. After the incident, upon realizing that her husband was seriously injured but still alive, she chose not to call an ambulance, a decision that might have increased his chances of survival. Instead, she called a colleague, Bill Luke Roy. Susie claimed she was confused and unsure of what to do in such a situation, so she sought advice from a family friend. This initially led some to speculate that Luke might have been involved in the crime, though no evidence supported this theory. According to Luke, Susie's voice lacked any signs of panic during their phone call. Nonetheless, Luke advised her to contact emergency services, which Susie did without hesitation after speaking with him. When experts investigated the scene and examined Bill's body, they discovered a bullet wound in his left hand. Strangely, despite the close-range attack, Susie, Bill's wife, was not covered in blood. Forensic experts noted that an attack at point-blank range typically produces small blood droplets. However, Bill's right hand was found neatly tucked beneath the pillow, which makes the possibility of him causing harm to himself in this manner highly unlikely. The prosecution built a strong case with a solid motive: financial gain. Susie, Bill's wife, appeared to benefit greatly from her husband's death, particularly in terms of insurance. Shortly before his death, Bill had made significant changes to his insurance policy. He increased the payout amount to nearly $2 million but removed Susie as a beneficiary. Instead, he designated the payout to his daughter from a previous marriage, Christine. Susie had even contacted the insurance company in advance to confirm the details of the policy. Crucially, these changes to the policy were set to take effect just days after Bill's death. During her call with the insurance company, Susie uncovered crucial information, which indirectly pointed to the possibility of a motive to act quickly. With Bill weighed down by financial troubles, his death could secure the money needed to resolve their outstanding debts. Apparently, Bill had removed Susie from the beneficiary list due to a lack of trust in her and instead sought to provide lifelong financial security for his daughter. This situation raised several troubling implications. Firstly, if Bill had planned his own death, he likely would have waited for the amended insurance policy to officially take effect, which would have occurred in just a few days. Furthermore, as someone knowledgeable in legal and financial matters, he would have been aware of Texas laws regarding voluntary death. Specifically, insurance policies do not pay out compensation to beneficiaries if the insured dies voluntarily within 2 years of the policy's activation. This means all of Bill's intentions to secure his daughter's future were doomed from the outset. Detectives believed that Bill had no intention of ending his life willingly. When he spoke about such matters, it was likely to evoke pity or manipulate others, such as persuading the bank to grant him a loan. However, given the strange circumstances surrounding his death, it seemed he didn't end his life himself, someone might have helped him. Based on circumstantial evidence, Susie was arrested and charged with her husband's murder. At the trial, a key forensic method was used: blood spatter analysis. This technique, first introduced in the 1950s by Herbert MacDonald, played a critical role in providing evidence and substantiating the charges. MacDonald himself testified during Susie's trial, offering essential insights. Blood spatter analysis had been a foundational method in the U.S. justice system and widely accepted for years. However, in 2009, the National Academy of Sciences raised doubts about its reliability, emphasizing that accurate and meaningful use of the analysis requires significant expertise and experience. Evidence in Bill's murder case was analyzed by inexperienced experts, but this oversight was overlooked during the trial. Although blood sample analysis has been heavily criticized, it remains valuable and continues to be used, now exclusively by highly qualified and experienced specialists. In the past, doubts about this method had led to the reconsideration of several convictions. However, by the time of Susie's case, Herbert MacDonald's method was widely accepted and largely unquestioned. During the trial, Susie's ex-husband defended her, stating that he had never observed any signs of aggression throughout their relationship. He also stated that Susie was not even aware of how to use a weapon. Additionally, a family friend named Luke, Bill's business partner and Susie's initial point of contact after the incident, supported her and expressed his belief that Bill may have willingly ended his own life. Luke explained that he had planned to leave the car dealership due to work-related issues, and this decision had deeply affected Bill. In the final days of Bill's life, he reportedly struggled with loneliness. The prosecutor's office persisted in proving its case. To strengthen its argument, it presented the marital bed as evidence during the trial, complete with two mannequins representing Bill and Susie, as well as traces of Bill's blood that were still visible. This allowed the prosecution to vividly illustrate its version of what transpired on that tragic night. Despite the defense's efforts, the jury ultimately convicted Susie of murder, sentencing her on June 5, 1988, to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After the verdict, Susie still had a group of supporters who believed in her innocence, including her son, Wade, and her daughter from a previous marriage. Both worked tirelessly to overturn the conviction, firmly convinced that Susie had stood by her husband until the very end and was incapable of violence against him. While Susie served time in prison, Wade enrolled in law school and dedicated himself to meticulously reviewing the case. He searched for errors or misconduct by the prosecution and investigators, hoping to find grounds for an appeal. Wade collaborated closely with his mother's lawyer to challenge the verdict and fight for justice. The case required processing a massive amount of complex information, which made the effort time-consuming. Wade was determined to secure justice as Susie had already spent 8 years in prison. Eventually, Susie's lawyer submitted a critical appeal that could not be dismissed. During the prosecution's case, the blood spatter analysis played a key role, but serious concerns emerged about whether the forensic expert had been qualified to handle this aspect. The expert had examined over 40 stains found on the nightgown. Interestingly, the prosecution's main piece of evidence turned out to be its biggest weakness. The defense disputed the accuracy of the tests conducted on the nightgown, arguing that various substances, not just blood, could cause the fabric to glow. Moreover, the nightgown had never been specifically tested for blood, and since it was no longer available, its credibility as evidence was entirely compromised. The appeal was accepted, leading to a thorough reconsideration of the evidence before the 1990 retrial. The absence of blood spatter on the weapon can be explained as follows. The gunshot to Bill's left arm likely occurred while he was holding the weapon under the pillow, with his left hand positioned on the opposite side of his head. The shot caused an exit wound. Certain actions of the experts during the retrial seemed questionable. For instance, the forensic expert who conducted Bill's autopsy made a key statement. Although he admitted that he could not be absolutely certain Susie had killed Bill, he maintained, perhaps to protect his reputation, that Bill could not have harmed himself without external assistance. Given that only Bill and Susie were in the house, Susie was naturally seen as the prime suspect. Wade's legal studies and collaboration with attorneys proved invaluable. Together, they uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that violated Susie's constitutional right to a fair trial. A major revelation emerged when the prosecution brought in Herbert MacDonald to re-examine Susie's nightgown and the prior findings. Contrary to the prosecutor's expectations, MacDonald decisively refuted the arguments supporting Susie's guilt. However, rather than sharing MacDonald's expert opinion, the prosecution deliberately concealed it and continued relying on the flawed evidence against Susie. Wade played a vital role in the fight for his mother's freedom. He now faced the challenge of presenting his findings to convince the jury. His analysis revealed deception on the prosecution's part, which violated the Brady Rule, a requirement for prosecutors to disclose all evidence that could potentially exonerate the defendant. MacDonald's findings were pivotal in exposing this misconduct. Finally, Susie's day in court arrived in January 1998. By then, the once vibrant woman had been deeply affected by her years in prison, reduced to a shadow of her former self. Yet, in her weary eyes, there remained a glimmer of hope. She continued to steadfastly maintain her innocence. Susie's friends, who attended the same unusual gathering where the bedroom was repainted after her husband's death, described the event as an odd prank. They explained that it was initiated by a woman attempting to cover up the unsettling red stains in the room. According to them, Susie was unaware that her actions would later lead to accusations of evidence tampering. Both friends defended her, with one stating that the room had not been cordoned off with police tape and no warning had been issued that the investigation was ongoing. In fact, investigators initially concluded that Bill's death was a result of self-harm and showed little interest in the scene. They had planned to close the case and archive it, allowing Susie to remain in the house without implementing any security measures, such as sealing the room with police tape. The other friend explained that the group merely wanted to help Susie, who hesitated to let her children return to a bedroom stained with blood. Influenced by alcohol, they decided to repaint the room before the kids came home. Neither friend believed that Susie was guilty of any wrongdoing. During the retrial, an unqualified expert who had analyzed Susie's nightgown admitted that his original testimony at her first trial was baseless and lacked scientific foundation. Forensic expert Herbert MacDonald reviewed the flawed methods used in the investigation and expressed disbelief. The stains were measured visually without proper tools, and there was no confirmation that the stains were even blood. As a result, the evidence was deemed unconvincing. Susie's lawyer presented a compelling argument during the trial, which led the jury to reconsider their stance. They began to entertain the possibility that Bill, Susie's husband, had voluntarily chosen to end his own life. Substantial evidence later emerged, outweighing the vague testimonies provided by several of Bill's friends. The defense strategy focused on one key factor underlying the tragedy: Bill's financial difficulties. After his loan application was denied, his business faced imminent collapse, pushing his family close to poverty. To ensure that his daughter from a previous marriage would receive a larger insurance payout, Bill is said to have decided to end his own life. He spent his remaining savings on increasing the life insurance payout for her. Bill's decision not to wait just a few additional days may have been driven by severe depression or a sudden deterioration in his mental health, which could have left him incapable of fully understanding the legal implications. Accounts of Bill's behavior in the days leading up to his death supported this conclusion. The defense attorney believed their case had been effectively argued. However, during the closing arguments, Susie unexpectedly lost control. As the prosecution delivered its final remarks, she screamed that she had not killed her husband and collapsed in tears. This emotional outburst took everyone by surprise. On one hand, the jury recognized the sincerity in Susie's tears and assertions of innocence. On the other hand, her uncontrolled aggression complicated the situation. Deliberations over the verdict lasted for 4 hours of tense uncertainty. Although no definitive resolution was reached regarding Susie's guilt or innocence, she was ultimately acquitted of all charges on January 23, 1998. Despite her acquittal, she continued to face opposition, with critics focusing heavily on her behavior throughout the trial. While Susie's actions were undoubtedly unusual at times, her supporters, including her son and daughter, attributed her behavior to the emotional toll and stress she endured during the ordeal. Her opponents, however, claimed that her outburst during the trial was a calculated attempt to manipulate the jury. In contrast, her lawyer argued that the outburst was unplanned, insisting that such a risky tactic would have been ill-advised, particularly since the defense had already presented substantial evidence that might have backfired with the jury. During subsequent hearings, it was revealed that the nightgown had never been used as evidence. This omission raised concerns among the investigative team, as items of such significance rarely vanish without explanation. Speculation arose that the prosecution, facing heavy criticism for their strategy, may have intentionally disposed of the nightgown to prevent further examination. This theory gained traction as many believed the nightgown might have undermined their case, particularly given the opinion of Herbert MacDonald, whose expertise could have discredited their claims. Faced with mounting challenges, the prosecution seemingly had no viable path to continue their case. Susie Mowbray was acquitted on her 50th birthday, turning the occasion into a celebratory milestone. She expressed her gratitude to her son, Wade, describing it as the best anniversary gift she had ever received. In a 2001 interview, she reflected on her release, noting that others who had been wrongfully convicted alongside her had already been freed for 3 years. Susie had spent nearly a decade in prison and shared her hope that her children would feel proud of their mother. However, not everyone supported the verdict. Bill's first wife and his daughter, Christine, believed the outcome was unjust, remaining convinced that Susie had evaded accountability for murder. After Bill's death, his first wife revealed that Susie had urgently sold off all of his belongings to secure money. This led to a fierce legal battle between Bill's first wife and Susie over his inheritance. Ultimately, no one received the life insurance payout. Susie had once planned to write a book about her struggles, but since 2002, there has been no news about her. During that time, she went to court in an attempt to reclaim Bill's insurance payout, but she ultimately lost the case. Susie's son, Wade, initially pursued a legal career but eventually left the field to provide advice to other clergymen. Interestingly, Susie, who had previously sought public attention and appeared in her husband's advertising campaigns in the 1980s, completely disappeared from public view after her failed attempt to secure the insurance funds. She did not attend the TV show in 2021 that covered her case, though her lawyer did. The lawyer described her situation as a tragedy, emphasizing that the businessman's widow had spent so many years behind bars, which had destroyed her life, while insisting he had always believed in her innocence. One peaceful afternoon in Florida, a 13-year-old girl walked into her home to find her 4 younger siblings screaming, crawling around in red stains on the floor. Small, bloody footprints all over the kitchen. There was no sign of forced entry. No goodbyes. Just 5 children, left alone beside their mother's body. And the killer who had vanished as if he had never existed. To understand why a mother became the target of such a vicious plan, we must go back many years, to where the tragedy really began. Sheila Lee Walsh, born in Topeka, Kansas on October 19, 1962, met her first husband, Alan Blackthorne, shortly after finishing high school. Sheila was small, kind, and quiet. She had a difficult childhood. Her father, an Air Force pilot, was often away, and he died in Laos when she was only 10 years old. She longed for stability, for love, and for a family she could build with her own hands. After college, Sheila found work as an office administrator at a local law firm. That was where she met the charming, confident Alan, a man who quickly swept the inexperienced young woman off her feet. On their 3rd date, he proposed. Within 3 months, they married. Born in June 1955, Alan was 7 years older and, at least on the surface, far more worldly, but Alan's past held shadows Sheila never saw. Long before adulthood, he showed concerning behavior, cruelty toward animals, obsessive attitudes toward girls, even an accusation of attempted abuse while in high school. He had several minor criminal charges, But thanks to a string of lenient judges and expunged records, the man standing before Sheila looked clean, respectable, harmless. Alan easily gained the trust of Sheila's family. Even after the wedding, none of them suspected what was coming. Soon, he convinced them to invest a large sum into his electronics business, claiming he was preparing to expand. They had no idea the business was already failing. By the time the truth surfaced, Alan had declared bankruptcy and whisked his young, pregnant wife off to Hawaii, far from home, dependent and expecting a baby. Sheila found herself cornered, torn between her loyalty to her parents and the father of her unborn child. She still hasn't realized the cruelty of the man she has been with all her life. Years later, much would be revealed. Alan had been married before. His first wife, Eileen, endured extreme physical and psychological abuse, choking, beatings, even being kicked in the stomach while pregnant. Immediately after childbirth, Alan insisted they give the baby up for adoption because he wasn't ready to be a father. His violence extended beyond people. When their dog had an accident on the carpet, Alan beat the animal to death. Not only that, at one point, he forced situations where Eileen's younger brothers would witness intimate moments, and he often pressured her into degrading scenarios for his satisfaction. He also had a habit of dressing in women's lingerie before asking to be driven to rough neighborhoods, where he would wander home alone, a dangerous thrill he craved. Eileen and her husband had a bad marriage that lasted 5 years. During that time, she became pregnant again. Frightened, she decided to have an abortion and secretly began making plans to leave him. His second wife, Mary, initially believed she had met a loving, attentive father figure, but the facade shattered quickly. Alan used her 2 young children to manipulate and control her, threatening violence if she ever tried to leave. After 3 years of escalating intimidation, she fled with her children in the middle of the night, fortunate to escape the prolonged torment Eileen endured. Then came Sheila. When Alan met her, he saw vulnerability and opportunity. They married in 1982. Until that moment, Sheila had no way of knowing about his abusive past or hidden obsessions. At first, he was everything she thought she needed: loving, attentive, protective. But the mask slipped. Slowly, affection turned into criticism, criticism into anger, and anger into daily emotional warfare. Sheila was young, inexperienced, conditioned to believe that any outburst from the man she loved must somehow be her fault. And Alan, skilled in manipulation, took full advantage of that. The turning point came 6 months into the marriage, when Alan, with Sheila in the passenger seat, was involved in a collision with a motorcyclist. The rider died at the scene, and Alan immediately fled, terrified that witnesses had seen him. He phoned his father, who urged him to file a false report claiming he had been attacked by an aggressive stranger and had driven off only to protect his pregnant wife. Alan was eventually charged with fleeing the scene of a fatal accident and failing to render aid. But the case ended in a hung jury, and the district attorney declined to retry him. In the end, Alan walked away without consequences, despite being responsible for the man's death. After the couple relocated, Alan resumed his attempts to revive his business ambitions. During that time, Sheila's sister visited and was alarmed by her appearance. Sheila was pregnant, but she looked shockingly frail, like the starving children often shown in charity campaigns of the 1,980 seconds. Sheila later admitted to her parents how grim things had become. Yet, despite everything, she had no intention of leaving her husband. Financial dependence kept her trapped. Alan was launching a new business selling electrical muscle stimulators. To secure support, he persuaded relatives to move with them to Honolulu. But in July 1985, the enterprise collapsed. Alan continued advertising the devices, but authorities arrested him and seized his inventory because he lacked the required permits and the machines failed certification. The incident erupted into a public scandal. After the business failed, Alan took Sheila back to California. There, Sheila confided more openly in her sister about what life in Honolulu had been like. Alan frequently insulted her, accused her of affairs, flaunted his own infidelities. He would bring other women into their home and have loud, intimate encounters within earshot of his wife and daughters. Sheila endured it all because she felt financially paralyzed. She had no savings, no support system, and had been isolated from her family. Back in the mainland United States, Alan again managed to attract investors for another business venture, once more involving muscle stimulation devices, this time medically approved. It was during this period that his cruelty escalated. Sheila's sister noticed that Sheila looked older, exhausted, and physically unwell. But alongside this decline came a flicker of resolve. For the first time, Sheila expressed a desire to leave him. A notion sparked after Alan tried to drown her by forcing her head into a toilet and flushing repeatedly. In September 1987, another attack occurred. Alan beat her with a belt before bed, then struck her repeatedly with his fists. Finally, Sheila called the police. Police arrested Alan, but the consequences were minimal, a fine rather than jail time. Sheila seized the chance to flee. She gathered her daughters and ran to the home of Janda, the family's former nanny. Unfortunately, Alan anticipated her escape and intercepted her there. While Janda hurried the children inside, Alan began beating Sheila. A neighbor witnessed the assault and rushed over, managing to drive Alan off. Furious, Alan climbed into Sheila's car, ran over the neighbor, smashed through a gate, then escaped in his own vehicle. He was arrested a few hours later. Miraculously, the neighbor survived with minor injuries. Alan received a $425 fine and 18 months of probation. Following Alan's arrest, Sheila fled with her daughters to Oregon to stay with her sister Carrie. She hid there for several weeks before realizing she could not live indefinitely in secrecy. She needed to face the legal process if she hoped to protect her children permanently. In October 1987, she wrote a detailed, 100-page account documenting years of Alan's abuse. By September 1988, the divorce was finalized in Sheila's favor. She received custody of their daughters, a vehicle, and $1,250 a month in child support. Later, Alan persuaded her to move to San Antonio, promising to buy her a home so she could live closer to the girls. Sheila eventually agreed, a decision she soon realized was a devastating mistake. Once she moved, Alan immediately began manipulating the children against their mother, and child support payments were routinely delayed. Sheila knew Alan had the financial means to pay. He simply chose not to. She had to take him to court for nearly every payment. Alan, obsessed with retaliation, studied family law constantly, searching for loopholes to use against her. He eventually succeeded in reducing the child support amount to $350 in a hearing Sheila hadn't even been notified of. That reduction forced her into further litigation. After additional hearings, the original support amount was reinstated, but each payment remained a battle, a deliberate torment Alan never stopped inflicting. Frustrated and desperate to receive compensation for the years of abuse she had endured, Sheila went back to court demanding her share of Alan's assets. But Alan was exceptionally skilled at hiding his money. Instead of the roughly $250,000 she was entitled to, Sheila received only about $22,000. Despite everything she had suffered, Sheila was determined to rebuild her life and create stability for her children. In August 1992, she met a gentle, soft-spoken man named Jamie Belush. Their relationship blossomed quickly. The two were married in June 1993. Jamie was a devout Christian, a former Marine, and an employee at a pharmaceutical company. Life finally seemed to be turning in Sheila's favor, but Alan was far from finished. He continued to look for new ways to torment his ex-wife. The day before Sheila and Jamie's wedding rehearsal dinner, Alan picked up the girls for a routine visit. Instead of returning them, he sent a bailiff to serve Sheila with yet another lawsuit, this time demanding expanded custody. Sheila and Jamie married the next day, but their honeymoon was overshadowed by the legal hearing that followed. As the girls grew older, around 8 or 9, Sheila began hearing troubling things from them. Her daughter, Stevie, eventually confided that Alan had touched her inappropriately. Sheila used this revelation as leverage. When Alan attempted to file another custody-related lawsuit, she informed him she was prepared to report him for molesting their daughter. Stevie's statement was formally recorded, but Sheila refused to make her daughter face the trauma again in court. The threat alone was enough. Alan backed down. From then on, all communication between them went strictly through attorneys. The children no longer wished to visit Alan, and meanwhile, Sheila began building a new life with Jamie. He wanted children of his own, but Sheila struggled to conceive. They turned to IVF, and in December 1995, Sheila gave birth to quadruplets, 3 boys and 1 girl. For a moment, the chaos of the past seemed finally behind her, yet danger continued to haunt her. When Sheila was 7 months pregnant, her sister Carrie came to visit. Just days earlier, the O.J. Simpson verdict had been announced. Hearing that Simpson had been acquitted of murdering his ex-wife terrified Sheila. She told Carrie she feared that if Simpson could get away with it, then Alan, who had spent years threatening, stalking, and tormenting her, might convince himself he could kill her too. Carrie tried to reassure her, but Sheila remained shaken. She even asked her sister to care for her children if anything ever happened to her, and to contact a woman named Enrule to share what she feared. By June 1997, Alan had filed yet another lawsuit, angry that Stevie had stopped visiting him. Sheila was prepared. She warned him plainly that if he pursued the case, she would report his inappropriate behavior toward their daughter. Realizing she was serious, Alan abruptly withdrew the lawsuit. Shortly afterward, he announced he wanted to terminate his parental rights altogether. Even so, he continued to stalk Sheila from a distance, and she believed he never stopped plotting revenge. Alan manipulated a neighbor into spying on her, convincing the woman that Sheila's children were being mistreated. The neighbor even installed enormous floodlights that shone directly into the Bellish family's bedroom every night. Sheila and Jamie complained repeatedly, but law enforcement did nothing. Eventually, the constant harassment drove them to make plans to move. One afternoon, while the nanny was watching the children, Sheila and Jamie returned home to discover that Daryl, Sheila's daughter from her first marriage, had visited her father. Despite losing all parental rights, Alan had still managed to see her. Sheila panicked, terrified he would discover where they were planning to relocate. In a moment of anger and fear, Sheila struck Daryl once with a belt. With Alan's encouragement, Daryl filed a domestic violence complaint, and because Alan no longer had legal rights to her, Daryl was immediately placed into protective custody while an investigation began. The court eventually found no evidence that Sheila or Jamie had abused or coerced their children. The family then quietly moved to Sarasota, Florida at night. But even there, peace was short-lived. A neighbor from Texas eventually revealed their new address to Alan. Daryl, still in state custody during the ongoing proceedings, remained a constant source of anxiety for Sheila and Jamie, who feared she might unintentionally disclose their location. The Bellishes were so cautious that even their closest friends back in San Antonio were told nothing more than a post office box number. During this period, Sheila's anxiety reached its peak. Even though she had been divorced from Alan for nearly 10 years, the fear that he might someday kill her never left her. And tragically, her fear wasn't irrational. Behind the scenes, Alan Blackthorne was actively trying to track her down. He first hired a private investigator to locate her. When that didn't work, he pressured the man into surveilling every Baptist church in the region, hoping to spot Sheila among the congregations. The task was unrealistic. There were simply too many churches, and the investigator eventually abandoned the effort. Alan then returned to the one vulnerable link he still had access to: Daryl, his daughter, who was in the custody of Child Protective Services due to ongoing court proceedings. Daryl was emotionally fragile and deeply conflicted, yet for months she managed not to reveal the Bellish family's new address, partly because she genuinely did not know it herself. But over time, Alan coaxed bits and pieces from her, small clues that slowly painted a picture, and once he had extracted the information he needed, he abruptly cut contact with her, ignoring her calls completely. Next, Alan used a ruse. He hired a man to deliver flowers to the general area Daryl had described. The delivery man went door to door at several houses, asking for Sheila. At one home, Jamie Bellush opened the door and casually accepted the bouquet, unknowingly confirming the correct address. The deliver flowers called Alan back with the details, unaware he had just become part of something far darker than a flower delivery. 13-year-old Stevie Bellish had never had a peaceful life, but everything reached its breaking point on the afternoon of November 7, 1997. She came home from school excited, ready to tell her mother she had been invited on her very first date. But the moment she reached the front steps, something felt wrong. The door was unlocked. Something Sheila never allowed. Inside, Stevie found her 4 younger siblings behaving strangely, screaming in a way she had never heard before. The children, all toddlers, were naked except for life jackets. It looked as if Sheila had been preparing to bathe them in the pool, a normal routine. But something had interrupted her. Stevie walked through the house calling for her mother, but heard nothing. She noticed what looked like red paint streaking her siblings' skin. But at 13, she still didn't fully grasp what she was seeing. Then she entered the living room and saw belongings scattered everywhere, signs of a violent struggle. In the kitchen, she saw clothes on the floor soaked in red. When she lifted them, her world broke open. Her mother, Sheila, lay beneath the pile. Stevie dialed 911, her voice shaking, and told the dispatcher that her 35-year-old mother was dead and that her throat had been cut. The dispatcher stayed on the line until the first officer arrived. The officer walked Stevie outside, where all 4 toddlers clung to her legs, covered in blood. When asked who could have done this, she answered instantly. She knew only one person who had ever wanted her mother dead: her biological father, Alan Blackthorne. Police soon learned that Sheila owned 20% of Alan's profitable medical equipment business, and that Alan owed her $7 million in court-ordered payments, money he had no intention of giving her. The financial motive was overwhelming, but investigators hit their first roadblock. Alan had an ironclad alibi. At the time of the murder, he was at a golf course in Texas. The medical examiner determined that Sheila had been dead for about 2 hours when Stevie found her. The killer first shot her in the face with a .45 caliber handgun. Little Tim, one of the quadruplets, was believed to have been clinging to her when she was attacked. The bullet entered her cheek, exited the back of her head, and sent her crashing to her knees so hard that bruises formed instantly. But she didn't die right away. Sheila somehow stood back up and staggered toward the wall phone. In the kitchen, bleeding heavily, she managed to dial 911, but never spoke, because the killer grabbed a butcher knife from its stand and slashed her throat repeatedly. Even then, Sheila fought. She had multiple defensive wounds, including one deep enough to expose the bone in her arm. The major veins on both sides of her neck were severed. Despite the severity of the wounds, the medical examiner concluded she could have survived if help had reached her in time. Instead, she collapsed on the kitchen floor while her 4 toddlers crawled through her blood, crying and screaming for a mother who could no longer respond. A single fingerprint was found in the dried blood, but it didn't match Alan's or anyone in the household. A broken, blood-stained knife lay next to her body. The crime was brutal. The scene was chaotic, and the killer had vanished. While questioning neighbors, Police located the owner of a landscaping company mowing a yard near the Belush home. The landscaper told officers he had seen a white car he didn't recognize pull up to the house earlier that morning. Inside sat a large, intimidating-looking man. Frightened, the landscaper tried not to stare, but he memorized the license plate. When officers ran the tag, it traced back to a woman in Texas, the grandmother of 21-year-old Jose Del Toro. When detectives questioned Alan Blackthorne, he behaved coolly, even giving interviews to the media. He insisted he had only hit Sheila once in their marriage and called it the worst mistake of his life. As expected, he denied killing her and attempted to blame Daniel Alex Rocha, a friend who owned the golf course he frequented. However, his story quickly unraveled. When police reached Daniel, he revealed something far more disturbing. Alan had hired 27-year-old Samuel Gonzalez, first paying him $9,000. Soon after, Gonzalez brought in his 21-year-old cousin, Jose Del Toro, because Alan didn't want to get his own hands dirty. Jose, once a popular high school football star and prom queen's boyfriend, had long since fallen from grace. By 21, he was deep into banned substances and desperate for money. He had a few minor legal problems in the past, but he wasn't known to be violent. That changed when Blackthorne paid him to kill a woman, claiming she was abusing her children. Alan provided Jose with an old photograph of Sheila holding their daughter, taken during their marriage. Investigators later found this photo among Jose's belongings, but Blackthorne made a critical mistake. He hired a pair of unusually incompetent hitmen. Jose used his real identification to check into a motel near the Belush home. Surveillance footage captured him buying camouflage clothing. During interrogation, he crumbled quickly. Jose admitted sneaking into the garage and watching Sheila with her children, noting she seemed like a loving mother. Completely unlike the monster Alan had described, he claimed he almost backed out. But Alan pressured him relentlessly, insisting Sheila was dangerous, had to be dealt with. Even so, parts of Jose's story conflicted with evidence, making investigators doubt his version of events. Samuel Gonzalez, who introduced Alan to his cousin, Jose Luis Del Toro, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder in June 1998 and was sentenced to 19 years in prison. Daniel Alex Rocha, 29, acted as the middleman connecting Alan with Samuel Gonzalez, was convicted in January 1999 of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole in February 1999. By the time authorities finally located Jose Del Toro, he had already fled to Mexico. With financial help from Rocha, he fought extradition for more than a year. Jose Del Toro was extradited to the United States in July 1999, pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and armed burglary in 2000 in Florida. Judge Paul Logan sentenced Jose to 2 consecutive life terms, the maximum sentence for both charges. At sentencing, he cried and asked Jamie Bellish for forgiveness, vowing to expose everyone involved in Sheila's murder. There's one more important step left, and that's taking down the man who masterminded the entire affair, Alan Blackthorne. With relentless support from Sheila's sister and a team of attorneys, investigators spent 2 full years building the case. Witness after witness came forward describing Alan's long history of abuse toward Sheila and his previous wives. Searches uncovered alarming evidence. Alan and his new wife, Maureen, had been planning Sheila's murder for months. In their garage, investigators found a wall covered with photographs, notes, and a step-by-step plan. Shockingly, the couple seemed so confident in their impunity that they never bothered to remove any of it. During the investigation, Alan transferred nearly $50 million in assets into Maureen's accounts. Jamie Bellish filed 2 civil suits against them, totaling $38 million, and pursued legal action against others involved in the conspiracy. On January 4, 2000, 44-year-old Alan Blackthorne was charged with conspiracy to commit murder and several related offenses. Because he was considered a flight risk, bail was denied. At trial, his daughters Stevie and Daryl testified against him. Alan never once looked at them, showing no emotion, no acknowledgement, nothing. Prosecutors presented nearly 40 pieces of evidence proving a calculated plot to kill Sheila. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated only a few hours before returning a unanimous verdict. Guilty on all counts, Alan Blackthorne was convicted of federal charges of conspiracy to commit interstate murder and interstate domestic violence. He received 2 concurrent life sentences without parole. Beginning at the Beaumont, Texas, federal prison, following his conviction, Alan Blackthorne was transferred to federal prison, where he quickly became a target. Inmates attacked him several times, once stabbing him repeatedly, and in another assault, driving a sharpened screwdriver into his eye. Despite the brutality of these attacks, Alan survived. On November 18, 2014, at the age of 59, he died in federal custody in Terre Haute, Indiana. The official cause of death was never released, even within his own family. Reactions were cold and distant. His wife, Maureen Blackthorne, who had been convicted on financial charges in 2004, filed for divorce the following year. Meanwhile, Jamie Bellush took custody of the quadruplets as well as Stevie, Sheila's daughter from her first marriage, but forgiveness did not come easily. Jamie struggled deeply with resentment toward Daryl, who had once confronted Sheila with allegations of abuse and unwittingly revealed clues about the family's location, information Alan Blackthorne later exploited. Although Daryl had been manipulated as a child and never intended harm, Jamie found it difficult to separate her innocence from the catastrophic consequences that followed. In 2001, after years of legal battles, Alan's remaining assets, roughly $4.5 million, were finally unfrozen and distributed among Sheila's children. It offered financial security but could never replace what they had lost. In the months before her death, Sheila had confided in her sister, asking her to contact writer Ann Rule if the worst ever happened. Honoring that request, her sister reached out. Rule later included Sheila's case in her work, ensuring that her story and the brutality she endured would never be forgotten. Daphne Huard-Boudreau was born in 1998 in Quebec, Canada. While she was still in school, her parents separated, so she spent her childhood in 2 homes. Despite the divorce, both parents remained present in her life. From an early age, Daphne was adaptable, empathetic, and remarkably skilled at soothing conflicts. She longed for harmony in her family, friendships, and relationships. Even as a teenager, she expressed dreams of working in psychology and helping people who struggled emotionally. By age 18, Daphne had graduated high school and was preparing for the next stage, choosing her profession and living independently. She already had a part-time job at a small store to feel financially free. On the outside, she seemed confident, but those close to her knew she was fragile. Anthony Pratelops, on the other hand, was born in Quebec but was placed under youth protection almost immediately after birth. By the age of 18 months, he had already lived in 3 different foster homes. He had been taken from his biological parents due to severe neglect, lack of basic care, and developmental risks. These early traumas left deep, lasting wounds. Later evaluations concluded that his capacity to form healthy emotional attachments had been severely damaged, though social services attempted to give him stability. The constant upheaval during critical years only worsened his condition. His early development was marked by explosive aggression, unpredictable behavior. Even in preschool, he struggled to form bonds with other children. He was distrustful, tense around adults, perceived emotional closeness as a threat. As a teenager, teachers complained about his behavior, and youth workers noticed he often had difficulty communicating. Beneath his anger was a profound fear of abandonment, a fear that shaped every relationship he entered, making them unstable from the beginning. For him, breakups were not a normal part of life. They were catastrophic losses. As he grew older, he became better at hiding his inner volatility, but he never learned to manage it. Outwardly, he seemed quiet and reserved, but inside, he remained the same frightened child who never understood why he had been given away and what he needed to do to prevent it from happening again. This emotional immaturity, hidden behind an adult facade, made his reactions unpredictable. As an adult, he had numerous encounters with law enforcement. Erratic behavior, disregard for rules, and hostility toward those in authority. Police records noted that he could react dangerously in stressful situations and recommended caution when dealing with him. Though these warnings resulted in no long-term supervision or structured support, in February 2015, Daphne met Anthony. She was 16, he was 20. The connection quickly developed into a romantic relationship. Daphne was finishing high school and still uncertain about her long-term plans. Yet she yearned for independence and the feeling of entering adulthood. To her, dating an older man seemed like a step toward maturity. Anthony was very attentive. He messaged, called her often, inviting her places. In the beginning, he appeared caring, invested, almost overly devoted. For Daphne, who naturally trusted others and always tried to see the good in people, his attention felt genuine. To those around them, the relationship appeared harmless at first. Few noticed the subtle red flags that were already forming beneath the surface. Daphne's parents had been uneasy about Anthony from the very beginning. He rarely visited their home and, when he did, he appeared guarded, tense, uncomfortable. Still, they chose not to forbid the relationship outright. Daphne was no longer a child, and they wanted to respect her autonomy. Believing she was capable of making her own choices, she reassured them repeatedly that everything was fine, leaving out the more troubling aspects of the relationship. For the first few months, things seemed calm. They spent time together, made plans for the future. Anthony pushed the idea that once Daphne turned 18, they should get their own apartment and live together. He insisted they were ready to be independent, that they could handle adult life as a team. Although she hesitated, Daphne slowly gave in. She liked being seen as someone mature enough to build a life with an older partner. And because he made her feel valued, she was aware he wasn't steadily employed and mostly lived on welfare. But she didn't focus on it. He said health issues kept him from working and that it wouldn't last forever. Even though she paid most of their expenses, she wasn't worried about it. During this period, Anthony began showing possessive behaviors, though not yet openly aggressive ones. He was jealous of her classmates and acquaintances, reacted strongly to social media messages, asked endless questions about people from her past. Occasionally, he told her to stop talking to anyone he believed didn't respect their relationship. It seemed like ordinary jealousy, nothing extreme, at least not yet. Looking back, the winter and spring of 2015 were likely the calmest months of their entire relationship. Neither Daphne nor her family understood how unstable and dangerous Anthony truly was. From the outside, their romance appeared like a typical teenage relationship filled with excitement, dreams. But the early signs were already there: dependency, control, and shrinking personal boundaries. Bit by bit, Daphne noticed her independence slipping away, replaced by constant efforts to adjust to his moods. Each month, she bent a little more, setting aside her own needs. She convincing herself that love meant patience, understanding. When Daphne turned 18, she moved into a small rented apartment with Anthony. Her parents strongly doubted the decision, but tried to honor her choices. The apartment wasn't far from her hometown, which created an illusion of safety. Daphne wanted to prove that she could handle adult life, manage responsibilities, and build a real relationship. But everyday reality quickly revealed a truth she had never seen. Living with Anthony was far more difficult than she expected. He didn't work or attend school and spent most of his time isolated in the apartment. Against that backdrop, his bursts of jealousy, anger escalated. He demanded constant attention, questioned her every move, monitored her phone, and scrutinized her conversations. His mood swung wildly, from intense affection to explosive rage. Any attempt by Daphne to go out alone or meet with friends ignited resentment or aggression. He wanted full control. Even short phone calls could spark arguments. Soon, he criticized everything: her clothes, her tone of voice, even small habits she never thought twice about. Anything could be turned into a fight. The practical and financial responsibility fell entirely on Daphne. She worked to pay rent, buy groceries, manage the household, and hold everything together. But the emotional pressure only intensified. Anthony repeatedly reminded her of his past and his life attempt and used it as a weapon to keep her close. He insisted he couldn't survive without her. These manipulative threats guilt-trip Daphne, making her believe she is responsible for his happiness. The first serious rupture came when Daphne finally gathered the courage to end the relationship. She told Anthony she wanted to break up and began packing her belongings. His reaction was immediate and explosive. He tore through the apartment in a blind rage, smashing objects, hurling her personal items, ripping cushions, breaking furniture. The noise was so loud that neighbors called the police. Officers arrived, documented the scene, and ordered him to calm down. But despite the destruction, Anthony wasn't arrested. He received only a warning. Daphne's parents rushed over as soon as they heard what had happened. They helped her pack what was left of her things and took her back home. She moved through the apartment in silence, stunned by how quickly everything had turned violent. Although she tried to appear composed, she was deeply shaken. Her parents worried about her emotional state. Sensing the inner conflict she wouldn't speak about, she was devastated. Realizing the relationship she had invested so much in was already collapsing. At this time, Anthony called, wrote, and sent long messages, begging, blaming stress, promising change. He insisted he wasn't angry, just desperate. Soon, he shifted to emotional manipulation, telling her he couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and was thinking about ending his life. He insisted she had abandoned him at the worst moment, that he needed her now more than ever. The guilt wore her down. Despite her fear, disappointment, and the frightening incident in the apartment, she couldn't cut him off completely. Pity and worry over his threats blurred the line between affection and responsibility. At 18, she didn't yet understand the difference between love and emotional dependency. Her parents tried to convince her not to return, but they avoided pushing too hard. They couldn't forbid her from contacting him. However, persuasion wasn't enough. Reluctantly, she returned, hoping to rebuild what they once had. But nothing improved. Moments of calm were quickly replaced by suspicion and the need for control. Anthony resumed monitoring her messages, demanding explanations for every absence, every conversation. Daphne began withdrawing. She stayed quiet, avoided confrontations, and stopped sharing her struggles with her family. Her self-confidence eroded. She was terrified that leaving him again might trigger another crisis or worse. Yet she also felt the relationship hollowing her out from the inside. Anthony sensed he was regaining power. He no longer needed visible aggression. His tactics shifted toward dependency. He used insults, silent treatments, and accusations of betrayal. Whenever she tried to express a thought or assert herself, he turned it into an attack. He insisted he couldn't survive without her, that something terrible would happen to him if she ever walked away. It became a psychological trap, caught between fear, pity, guilt, and hope. Daphne lost her ability to see the situation clearly. She lived in a constant state of tension, convinced she couldn't leave without causing him irreversible harm. Her attempt to save someone she cared about slowly cost her control over her own life. In March 2017, Daphne is determined to end her relationship with Anthony. She had already tried to rebuild this relationship too many times. This time, she simply packed her belongings, left their shared apartment, and didn't look back. For the next few days, she alternated between her mother's home and her father's, taking advantage of their separate households to avoid staying in one place for too long. Anthony refused to accept that the breakup was final. To him, this was just another temporary withdrawal, something she had done before and eventually reversed. He continued sending her messages every day, shifting between desperate pleas for her to come back and angry accusations of betrayal. He called repeatedly, but Daphne never answered. When he could no longer reach her directly, he began contacting her parents, texting her mother to ask where she was. But he received no reply. Soon, he turned to her friends and acquaintances, asking if they knew where she was staying. He monitored her social media activity, checking when she appeared online. His efforts to reach her became increasingly intrusive. Relentless, Daphne eventually shut off her phone entirely, knowing that any response, no matter how small, would pull her back into the same destructive cycle. Anthony then began using intermediaries. He asked acquaintances to drive past her parents' homes to check if her car was there, searched for any opportunity to corner her into a meeting. Her silence wasn't a rejection in his eyes. It was merely a temporary obstacle he needed to overcome. Around this time, Anthony discovered that Daphne had begun seeing another young man, Alexis, her co-worker. He didn't know the details, but the idea alone was enough to push him into a dangerous emotional spiral. He felt humiliated, abandoned, and replaced. To him, Daphne hadn't simply left, she had betrayed him. Rejection was something he had never been able to process. Now his agitation grew deeper, darker, and more volatile. Driven by anger and wounded pride, Anthony recorded a video message, posted it online. The video lasted several minutes. In it, he accused Daphne of destroying his life, said she had used him, manipulated him, and thrown him away. He insisted he loved her more than anyone ever would, yet she supposedly didn't appreciate it. While he made no explicit threats, the emotional volatility was unmistakable. He looked furious, unhinged. When Daphne's family discovered the video, they were horrified. Her father couldn't understand why the platform had not removed it immediately. To see the man who terrified his daughter publicly attacking her, without consequence, was deeply unsettling. But more importantly, the video exposed the truth. Anthony was in a dangerous mental state, driven by obsession, jealousy. In the final days before the tragedy, fear hovered over everything. Daphne sensed that Anthony wanted to confront her, but she tried not to show it. She didn't want to frighten her parents or burden them with her anxiety. She believed that staying calm, not reacting, and keeping her distance would prevent him from escalating. She didn't know how far he was willing to go. On the cold, snowy night of March 2017, Anthony made his move. Around 11 o'clock p.m., he left his home in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu and began walking toward Boucherville, where Daphne was staying with her father. He had no car, so he trudged through freezing temperatures and unplowed streets on foot. The walk took nearly 2 hours. This wasn't an impulsive decision. Around 1 o'clock a.m., he arrived at the property. Keeping out of sight, he slipped into the back seat of a car parked in the driveway. It wasn't Daphne's own vehicle. It was her mother's car, lent to her while hers was being repaired. Anthony knew she would drive this car to work in the morning. Around 10:30 a.m., on March 21, 2017, Daphne quietly stepped out of her father's house to head to work. She walked toward the car her mother had lent her, only to freeze when she opened the door. Anthony was sitting in the back seat, motionless. Waiting, he said he only wanted to talk. He repeated that they needed to clear things up, refusing to leave the car. Shocked and already running late for her shift, Daphne tried calmly asking him to get out. But he wouldn't move. Unable to force him out and wanting to avoid escalation, she got behind the wheel, drove, with Anthony silently riding along in the back seat. He didn't touch her. He didn't raise his voice. But Daphne felt the tension, his hidden intentions. When they arrived at the small grocery store where she worked, Daphne quickly got out of the car and went inside. Anthony followed her. Her co-workers immediately noticed his behavior. Tense, fixated, standing too close, watching her every move. The atmosphere grew increasingly unsettling, concerned. Her colleagues called the police. Officers arrived shortly afterward and confirmed that Anthony's behavior was intrusive, worrisome. They separated him from Daphne, escorted him outside, and spoke with him privately. He didn't show aggression, but he was clearly emotionally unstable. When officers asked if she wanted to file a complaint, Daphne declined. She insisted she wasn't afraid, that he hadn't laid a hand on her, hadn't threatened her, that she didn't want to escalate the situation. She told them she had everything under control. So the police issued only a verbal warning. Anthony then called a taxi and left. Afterward, Daphne returned to her shift, exhausted but determined to keep going. She wanted to believe it was over, that this was just another unpleasant episode she would eventually move past. She didn't consider herself in danger, but for Anthony, that morning was not the end. It was preparation. He had not let go. Over the next hours, Daphne stuck to her strategy of silent distance, thinking that if she ignored him and refused to react, he would eventually give up. The next day, March 22, 2017, Daphne decided to go to Anthony's apartment to collect the last of her belongings. What drove her to act was fear for her pets, her cat and 2 lizards. She worried he might neglect them or harm them out of spite. Before leaving, she went to the police station. She explained her situation, told them she needed to pick up her things, and admitted she didn't feel safe. Because Anthony was already known to police for instability, the officer she spoke to strongly advised her not to go alone. A female officer was assigned to quietly accompany her, following in a separate vehicle so as not to provoke Anthony but still close enough to intervene if necessary. They arrived at the building around noon. As Daphne entered the building, the policewoman waited outside. After waiting longer than expected without seeing Daphne return, the policewoman quickly followed. However, she mistakenly entered the wrong section of the complex. After several minutes of double-checking the address, she finally found the correct entrance and floor. Unfortunately, this delay had serious consequences. When she got to the apartment door, everything was silent. She knocked, but no one answered. Then, she saw a shadow move behind the glass, and a man's voice said, "Arrest me." The door opened. Anthony stood there, expression blank, hands soaked in blood. "This isn't my blood," he said flatly. The officer immediately ordered him to step out. He complied without resistance. His demeanor was eerily calm. The officer called for backup and an ambulance, then entered the apartment. It was silent inside. Near the stairs, she found Daphne's body on the floor. She was dead. Later, forensic analysis revealed she had suffered 15 stab wounds, most concentrated around her chest and neck. Her throat had also been slashed. One of the wounds alone would have been fatal. The rest reflected a frenzy, the kind of violent outburst committed by someone in a state of overwhelming rage. The time wasted finding the right building and entrance led to tragic consequences. Although law enforcement acted according to procedure, this situation highlighted a critical reality. When confronting a potentially dangerous individual, even a minor delay can have fatal consequences. The crime scene clearly showed what happened. Blood was splattered throughout the apartment. Bloody handprints marked the leg of a table. A partial shoe print smeared the lower portion of the door. The attacker didn't try to hide anything. Anthony was arrested immediately and taken to the police station. There, he confessed without hesitation. He did not deny what he had done, nor did he attempt to justify it. He said only that he had crossed a line and that it happened fast. He provided no additional explanation, nor did he show any remorse. Physically, he appeared stable. He had no visible injuries and declined medical treatment. As interrogations began, news of the killing reached Daphne's family. Her father was the first to receive the call, asking him to come to the police station. When he arrived, the truth was revealed. His daughter was dead. The shock was overwhelming. Daphne's mother collapsed emotionally, struggling to process what she was hearing. Her father sat in disbelief, unable to comprehend that the danger they had feared for months had now become reality. They learned that Anthony had confessed and was in custody. The family was initially instructed to stay away from the crime scene while technicians worked. Her father refused. He insisted on seeing his daughter, an image that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The investigation progressed quickly after Anthony's arrest. With his confession on record and the evidence overwhelming, the case proceeded to trial in 2019. He was ultimately convicted and sentenced to life in prison, with no eligibility for parole for the first 18 years. But public attention soon shifted toward a controversial aspect of the legal process. Prosecutors and defense attorneys reached a plea deal, reducing the charge to second-degree murder on the grounds that premeditation couldn't be conclusively proven. Under Canadian law, this meant the killing was classified as intentional but not planned. For Daphne's family, this was devastating. Her father firmly believed the crime was premeditated. He pointed to Anthony's actions, waiting for her in the car, tracking her movements, posting disturbing messages online, and committing the murder within minutes of her entering the apartment. None of this, he argued, aligned with a spontaneous crime of passion. To him, these were unmistakable signs of preparation, of first-degree murder. After the funeral, the family sought support from the Crime Victims' Compensation Office to cope with the emotional and financial impact of their loss. But their initial application was rejected. According to the agency, since the parents had not been physically harmed themselves, they were not considered direct victims under the law and were therefore not eligible for compensation. The family appealed the decision, and after a lengthy process, the appeal was successful. The original decision was overturned. The parents received some compensation, primarily to help with the costs of psychological counseling and lost wages. While the amount of money was not large, it marked an acknowledgement that the system recognized the weight of their loss. At the same time, public attention turned sharply toward the question of police responsibility. The actions of the officers involved on the day of the murder were scrutinized in both media and community discussions. One officer, the one tasked with escorting Daphne to collect her belongings, had mistakenly entered the wrong building and lost several crucial minutes. The second officer, the one who spoke to Daphne on the day of the workplace incident, did not insist on formal accompaniment, even though Anthony's escalating behavior clearly warranted greater protection. Both officers were summoned for a professional ethics review. After internal hearings, neither faced disciplinary consequences. Officially, their actions did not constitute a breach of protocol. For Daphne's family, and especially her father, the outcome was enraging. He publicly condemned the decision, stating that the police had gravely underestimated the risk. Anthony was already known to authorities as emotionally unstable and potentially dangerous. His stalking, his obsessive messages, the online video, and his aggressive behavior at Daphne's workplace were unmistakable warning signs. In the father's view, every one of those signs had been minimized until it was too late. For Daphne's loved ones, the pain has not faded with time. They lost a daughter in the most violent way imaginable, and then had to fight for acknowledgement that her death was not an unavoidable tragedy, but a preventable one. No link in the chain, police, prosecutors, or social services, took responsibility. Daphne's story became a stark symbol in Quebec of how the line between psychological abuse and imminent danger is too often ignored. It is a reminder of how hesitation, procedural gaps, and institutional subjectivity can create deadly consequences. A suburban house has been transformed into a place of horror, with bloodstains splattered all over the walls. The most haunting detail is the tiny fingerprint of a child that remains. This was the sight that greeted Jennifer O'Brien when she entered her parents' home to retrieve her son, Nathan. The case was so macabre and deeply disturbing that many struggled to accept it as reality. Regardless, it happened, and the whole country would soon be watching the investigation that followed. This story brings us to Park Hill, a neighborhood located within the city of Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Known for its tranquil atmosphere and the warmth of its local residents, Park Hill offers a picturesque environment with well-maintained homes, tree-lined streets, modern infrastructure, and a welcoming sense of community. The area radiates calm, stability, making it a highly desirable place for families seeking peace and security. These qualities were precisely what drew the Lickneys family to settle in here. Alvin Lickness, a beloved father and grandfather, was 66 years old at the time. He was a man of authority, respect, both within his family and throughout his professional life. With retirement approaching, Alvin eagerly looked forward to beginning a new chapter, one filled with freedom after years of responsibility. His wife, Kathy Lickness, aged 53, was the heart of the family. She was not only a devoted wife but also her daughter's closest confidant. Her caring and nurturing nature allowed her to create a warm, inviting home for everyone she loved. Park Hill had been their home for many years, but they had recently decided it was time to downsize. They were preparing for a move to Edmonton, planning a more modest living arrangement as they entered retirement. Alvin and Kathy stood on the threshold of enjoying this long-awaited stage of life. They listed their house for sale, along with several pieces of furniture and household items. Their daughter, Jennifer O'Brien, visited her parents' home one final time with her children, including her cheerful 5-year-old son, Nathan. In just 1 week, her parents were scheduled to leave this house permanently. Jennifer felt a quiet sadness. This was the place where she grew up and spent her childhood with her siblings. Alvin and Kathy had also secured an apartment in Mazatlan, Mexico, where they planned to spend the winter enjoying the warm sun before eventually moving on to Edmonton. But they would never have the chance to enjoy their golden years. Just 1 day later, their hopes and plans vanished into a nightmare that engulfed everything around them. Nathan O'Brien was a lively child with a cherubic face, perpetually tousled, sun-kissed hair. He was the middle child among Jennifer's 3 children, known for his love of superhero costumes and his friendly, outgoing nature. Nathan was adored by nearly everyone he met. He easily made friends with both children and adults. Nathan possessed an endless curiosity for the world around him, always eager to explore something new. Jennifer and the children spent a pleasant day at the family home in Park Hill. As the evening approached and darkness settled in, Jennifer decided to stay a little longer rather than drive immediately with 3 tired children. Nathan, worn out from playing outdoors, fell asleep almost instantly. At approximately 11 o'clock p.m., Jennifer decided to take her other children home, leaving Nathan asleep beside his grandmother. With plans to return for him in the morning, Nathan had long wished to spend the night with his grandparents. And Jennifer didn't want to deny him that simple joy. On the morning of June 30, 2014, Jennifer arrived at her parents' home to pick up her son, unaware that she was about to witness something beyond comprehension. The front door was standing wide open. As she cautiously looked inside, she saw pools of blood, and a heavy, metallic odor filled the air. Blood appeared everywhere. On the beds, the walls, the floors, and throughout the hallway, a dark trail of sneaker prints and smeared, bloody streaks suggested that someone had been dragged through the house. The most devastating sight of all was a small child's handprint pressed against the wall, as if the boy had leaned on it to steady himself. Jennifer couldn't find her parents or her 5-year-old son anywhere in the house. She immediately called her husband, telling him she believed her entire family had been killed and their bodies taken away. Shaking and overwhelmed, Jennifer then dialed emergency services and repeated the same message. The dispatcher instructed her to return to her car and lock the doors immediately. In case the person responsible was still inside the house or nearby, Jennifer sat behind the steering wheel, staring at the home where she had spent so many happy moments with her family. The image of the small handprint on the wall replayed endlessly in her mind. Police officers arrived quickly and entered the house. They conducted a thorough search of every room, but no bodies were found. Alvin and Kathy Lickness, along with little Nathan, had vanished without a trace. An Amber Alert was soon issued. Despite the horrific condition of the house, investigators held on to hope that the three had been abducted and were being held somewhere alive. Law enforcement officers collected DNA samples throughout the Lickness home but initially found no fingerprints or DNA belonging to an obvious suspect. During the forensic examination, investigators discovered a tooth inside the residence, believed to belong to Alvin Lickness. Blood found on a pair of heavy dumbbells in the garage was later confirmed to match his DNA. Investigators also noted that a lock on a side door had been damaged, suggesting that the attacker may have entered the house that way during the night. Police questioned approximately 200 people who had attended the estate sale held at the home shortly before the disappearance, as hundreds of officers searched tirelessly for the missing family and found no trace of them anywhere. Investigators were forced to return to the starting point, the Lickness home. Detectives considered the possibility that Nathan may have witnessed something terrifying and tried to hide. They carefully searched every closet, storage space, and area beneath the beds, anywhere a frightened child might conceal himself, but found nothing. For weeks, police continued to believe that Alvin, Kathy, and Nathan might be alive somewhere and that the injuries sustained in the home might not have been fatal. As time passed, however, that hope began to fade. Despite extensive searches, no bodies were found. It became increasingly clear that this was not a kidnapping but a brutal attack on 3 members of the same family. The person responsible remained at large, Nathan's parents, unwilling to accept the possibility that their son had passed away. Contacted him directly through televised appeals. They reminded Nathan that he was a superhero, telling him he was brave, strong, and could handle anything. They promised they would find him and bring him home. Jennifer, speaking through tears, begged her son not to be afraid. The people watching her desperate request were touched. They didn't know for sure if the child was still alive. The public shared in the family's anguish, feeling profound sympathy but powerless to help. The Amber Alert failed to produce any immediate, concrete results. Over the course of several days, police received more than 1,300 tips from across the region. Residents of nearby homes and businesses did everything they could to assist the investigation, voluntarily submitting hours of surveillance footage recorded during the night in question. Detectives painstakingly reviewed hundreds of hours of video footage, searching for anything out of place. Eventually, something subtle yet troubling emerged. On the night Alvin and Kathy Lickness, along with their 5-year-old grandson Nathan O'Brien, disappeared, a vehicle was seen repeatedly driving through the Park Hill neighborhood. In one frame, A figure appeared lingering near the Lickness residence in the early morning hours. Shortly afterward, a pickup truck was captured traveling north, away from Calgary. In the bed of the truck was a large object concealed beneath a white covering. Police quickly released flyers showing an image of a late 1982 to early 1990s green Ford F-150 pickup truck, believed to have been present on the Lickness Street that night. Investigators were eager to identify both the vehicle and its driver, suspecting they could hold crucial information about the disappearance of Alvin, Kathy, and Nathan. Publicizing the image proved to be a pivotal decision. A woman who recognized the truck contacted authorities. The caller was Patty Douglas, and the truck belonged to her brother, Douglas Garland, 56. Douglas Garland had a long, troubling history. In his youth, he was expelled from medical school after being caught cheating. Over the years, he had been repeatedly arrested for weapons-related offenses and assaults, though charges were often dropped or never pursued, allowing him to evade lasting consequences. In 1992, Douglas was convicted after police discovered a methamphetamine lab on his rural property. To avoid arrest and imprisonment, he fled to British Columbia, where he assumed the identity of a teenager who had died in a car crash. Under this false identity, Douglas lived undetected for several years, working in a laboratory, later collecting unemployment benefits while concealing his true name. In 2000, authorities uncovered the deception. Douglas was arrested and ultimately sentenced to 6 months in prison for banned substances-related offenses and identity theft. Psychological assessments at the time characterized him as mentally unstable but not prone to violent behavior. Based on those evaluations, he served only his sentence and was released. In July 2014, police detained Douglas Garland once again, this time at a bus stop in Calgary, citing an outstanding charge related to document forgery. Douglas refused to cooperate and provided no information to investigators. Let's get back to the case. Given the fear that the Lickness couple and Nathan might still be alive and in danger, police authorized an urgent search of Douglas's rural property, invoking an emergency legal exception rather than waiting for a full search warrant. An emergency response team launched what was initially treated as a potential hostage rescue operation, storming the over 16-hectare farm where Douglas lived with his elderly parents. Investigators believed that a rural property offered the greatest opportunity to conceal victims. Despite an intensive search, neither the missing family members nor any bodies were found. One detail, however, drew attention: a barrel near a greenhouse that was still smoldering inside. Officers found only ash, no blood, no identifiable remains, and no immediate physical evidence. With no grounds to hold him at that time, Douglas Garland was released on bail under strict conditions, including an order not to return to the farm. Soon after, police obtained a comprehensive search warrant. More than 300 officers meticulously combed the property, surrounding fields, and nearby wetlands, while forensic specialists focused on the structures themselves. Deep within the basement, investigators uncovered disturbing materials, including books and manuals containing graphic and violent imagery. Further searches revealed boxes filled with restraints, some small enough to fit a child's wrists. Additional items included hacksaw blades, leather straps, bone saws, knives, firearms, even a straitjacket. Authorities also discovered a computer hard drive hidden beneath the rafters in the basement. The hard drive contained an extensive collection of material related to violence. Gathered through meticulous online research, Douglas had downloaded numerous documents and instructions from the internet, including information on how to attack victims in the early morning hours to maximize the element of surprise, descriptions of painful methods of torture, and guides explaining how to kill without experiencing emotional involvement. The hard drive also contained disturbing images related to Douglas's personal obsessions and fantasies. On shelves nearby, investigators found books focused on poisoning and violent crime. Among them were photographs involving adults wearing diapers, with their hands and feet restrained, some appearing unconscious or possibly deceased. Investigators also uncovered a kit designed for impersonating a woman in the basement. It included silicone breast prostheses, 2 long blonde wigs, racks of women's clothing, and an extensive shoe collection consisting of 89 pairs of boots, shoes, sneakers that fit Douglas's feet. One empty shoebox found in the closet drew particular attention. The sole pattern printed on the box could have been compared to an imprint found at the Lickness home, but the corresponding pair of shoes was missing. Meanwhile, Douglas violated the conditions of his release and returned to the farmhouse without notifying Calgary police. Detectives monitoring his movements believed he intended to destroy or conceal evidence hidden in the basement. His second arrest occurred as Douglas attempted to move through dense trees and thick brush, while a police helicopter hovered overhead. He was formally charged with the murders of Nathan O'Brien, Catherine "Kathy" Lickness, and Alvin Lickness. Nearly 2 weeks had passed since their disappearance, and although no bodies had yet been recovered, prosecutors proceeded based on an overwhelming volume of evidence. More than 1,400 individual items collected during the investigation. At that stage, it had not yet been definitively proven that Douglas Garland was the man who carried out the brutal attack on Alvin, Kathy, and Nathan. The investigation continued without pause. Detectives decided to re-examine the contents of a smoldering barrel that had been noticed during the initial search of the farm. As forensic specialists carefully sifted through the ashes, they made a chilling discovery. Among the remains were a child's tooth, charred human tissue, a metal eyeglass frame, and numerous fragments of human bone. A subsequent investigation revealed a layered history between Douglas and the Lickness family, stretching back many years. Patty Douglas, Douglas's sister and the woman who alerted police about the pickup truck, was the common-law wife of Alan Lickness, one of Alvin and Kathy's sons. This family connection drew immediate attention from investigators. It soon emerged that Alvin and Douglas had worked together years earlier. In 2006, Alvin, a successful businessman, was seeking technical assistance for a project, and Alan suggested Douglas as a potential collaborator. Douglas, who possessed some technical knowledge of mechanical engineering, began working with Alvin on the development of an industrial pump for the oil and gas industry. The pump itself was Alvin's invention, and Douglas was hired to help refine, improve certain aspects of the design. However, the project was never commercialized. By early 2007, the working relationship came to an end. After losing his position, Douglas became increasingly resentful. The termination appeared to fuel a deep-seated anger that lingered for years, gradually hardening into bitterness. Investigators think Douglas's anger built up over time until he violently destroyed what he blamed for his humiliation. While there was no evidence that Nathan had been a specific target, authorities believed Douglas was unwilling to leave any witnesses behind. His actions showed no regard for age or innocence. His focus was on revenge. In January 2017, Douglas Garland stood trial in a packed Calgary courtroom, where he pleaded not guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder. Throughout the proceedings, he filed no motions and remained largely expressionless. The trial drew national attention, becoming one of the most closely followed criminal cases in Canada, as the public struggled to comprehend the brutality of the crime. Just 1 day before their disappearance, Alvin and Kathy Lickness had held an estate sale at their Park Hill home, preparing to sell the property and downsize. Douglas, who had harbored resentment toward Alvin for years over the failed pump project and the associated patent, appeared to seize this moment. Investigators believe, in the early hours of June 30, 2014, Douglas gained entry to the Lickness home by drilling through the lock on a side door. Instructions on how to defeat such locks were later found on his computer. While the household slept, Douglas went to the master bedroom, where Alvin was resting, and struck him multiple times with a heavy blunt object. He then moved to the guest bedroom, where Kathy and 5-year-old Nathan were sleeping. DNA evidence confirmed that both were attacked there. The extent of blood loss indicated that Kathy also suffered a severe blow from a blunt instrument. The precise cause of Nathan's injuries could not be determined, but forensic evidence clearly showed that he had been bleeding. Despite the extensive bloodshed inside the house, forensic experts concluded that all 3 victims were still alive when Douglas dragged them from their beds and forced them out of the home. Investigators believed he transported them in the back of his pickup truck, bound and concealed beneath a white covering later observed in surveillance footage. No usable fingerprints or DNA belonging to Douglas were found at the residence. Consistent with evidence that he had studied detailed online instructions on how to avoid detection, Douglas then drove the victims to his parents' rural farm near Airdrie, located more than 30 kilometers from the Lickneys' home. Investigators later determined that Nathan and his grandparents were subjected to extreme violence at the property. DNA belonging to all 3 victims was recovered from multiple tools found on the farm, including meat hooks, bone saws, and knives. Their genetic material was also discovered on the exterior of a pair of rubber boots near one of the outbuildings. Inside that structure, a blood-stained light switch contained DNA matching both Alvin and Kathy Lickness. A forensic computer specialist testified about the discovery of photographs of Kathy and Alvin among deleted files recovered from a hard drive belonging to Douglas. The evidence suggested that Douglas had been monitoring the lives of those he considered his enemies, likely through publicly available information and social media platforms. Douglas's own mother also took the stand and testified against her son. She described him as a solitary man who had no close friends, though she added that he was intelligent, enjoyed reading, and helped around the family home. She testified that Douglas had earned a Bachelor of Science degree, later enrolled at the University of Alberta, but studied there for only a short period before suffering a nervous breakdown. When she later saw a television report about the disappearance of the Lickness family and mentioned it to Douglas, he reportedly said that he did not want to talk about Alvin. She also stated that she did not hear her son leave the house that night and therefore could not provide specific details about his movements. As expected, the defense argued that there was no direct forensic or scientific evidence placing Douglas Garland inside the Lickness home on the night of the attack. Defense counsel emphasized that no eyewitness had seen Douglas commit the murders and that there was no definitive proof showing how or why the 3 victims had been killed. According to the defense, the case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence. On February 6, 2017, near the conclusion of the trial, prosecutors presented what they described as a pivotal piece of evidence, one discovered purely by chance. At 9:30 a.m. on July 1, 2014, the day after the attack at the Lickness residence, a small aircraft operated by an aerial mapping company was flying over airspace near Airdrie, Alberta, conducting routine photographic surveys of the area and surrounding communities north of Calgary. The aircraft captured images every 3 seconds and, by extraordinary coincidence, recorded 2 photographs that would later be introduced in court and significantly strengthen the case against Douglas. The images appeared to show 3 human figures lying face down on the ground near several outbuildings south of the main farmhouse. 2 of the figures were clearly adults, unclothed except for white material wrapped around their waists. Experts were able to estimate their approximate heights, one about 6 feet 2 inches, another about 5 feet 6 inches. A third, much smaller figure was visible nearby, lying on its side in the grass close to a burn barrel. The prosecution suggested that the smaller figure was a child. The pilot who operated the aircraft testified that when he flew over the same area approximately 26 hours later, the figures were no longer visible in the photographs. In this tragic case, the silence of the victims spoke volumes. No intact bodies were ever recovered, only fragments. The sole physical confirmation of their deaths was found among the ashes in the burn barrel charred tissue, bone fragments, and remains belonging to Nathan O'Brien and his grandparents. Investigators concluded that after dismembering the bodies, The killer attempted to destroy them by fire in a crude and prolonged process resembling cremation. As these horrifying details were presented in court, Douglas remained outwardly unmoved, at times appearing to take notes. He showed no visible signs of remorse. After several hours of emotionally devastating testimony and approximately 10 hours of jury deliberation, a verdict was reached. The judge presiding over the Calgary triple murder case imposed the harshest sentence allowed under Canadian law. Douglas Garland, convicted of the first-degree murders of Nathan O'Brien, Alvin Lickness, and Kathy Lickness, was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms, with parole ineligibility periods totaling 75 years. In practical terms, Douglas would be 129 years old before he could even apply for parole. In the period following Douglas's sentencing, reports indicated that life in custody was far from easy for him. As the details of the crimes became widely known among other inmates, he was subjected to hostility and abuse because of the brutal killing of 3 innocent people, including a 5-year-old child, over a grievance that dated back several years. His actions had marked him as one of the most despised offenders in the prison system. The devastating events of the case left a deep and lasting impact on the family and on society as a whole. The void created by the loss of Alvin, Kathy, and young Nathan was immeasurable. The consequences of this tragedy extended far beyond the courtroom, embedding themselves in the hearts of everyone who had known and loved them. No words can fully capture the pain endured by Nathan's parents. Jennifer and Rod O'Brien continue to face this loss day after day, raising their 2 sons and learning how to live in a world where their little superhero is no longer by their side. Amid unimaginable grief, Rod and Jennifer found a way to transform their pain into something meaningful. In Nathan's memory, they established the Nathan O'Brien Children's Foundation, an organization dedicated to improving the lives of children facing hardship. The foundation was created to honor Nathan by giving other children opportunities, hope, and support, things his parents believe every child deserves. Nathan loved sports, and in his honor, the foundation organizes annual sporting events for children, including hockey programs. Imagining how much joy he would have found in being part of those games. Another thing Nathan loved dearly was talking with his father before bedtime. Their final conversation remains etched in Rod's memory. That night, Nathan asked what heaven was like, an unusual question for a 5-year-old. He spoke about being a superhero, flying through the sky and cutting through the clouds with his hands. He told his father that one day he would meet his parents in heaven. In hindsight, Rod has often wondered whether his son somehow sensed what was to come. Nathan's mother, Jennifer, watches with tears in her eyes as her son's friends grow older, knowing she will never see her own boy grow into adulthood. The Lickness and O'Brien case remains one of the most tragic chapters in Calgary's history, leaving a permanent scar not only on the city, but on the entire country. The deaths of Alvin, Kathy, and little Nathan stands as a painful reminder of how fragile life can be, and of the importance of cherishing those we love. The hole in the roof was small. Too small, some would later say. It punched through the ceiling of a conference room in the Belvedere Hotel's annex in Baltimore. Beneath it, in a quiet space rarely used, lay the decomposing body of a man who had been missing for 8 days. His name was Ray Rivera. Ray was 32 years old. He was a writer and a husband. According to his loved ones, he had no reason to vanish without explanation. The discovery came on May 24, 2006. Not through police procedure, but by chance. According to reports, employees noticed vultures gathering on the rooftop of the annex, an unusual and unsettling sight in the middle of the city. When the area was checked, the body was found below, in a position that raised more questions than answers. Authorities quickly began reconstructing what might have happened. The most immediate theory was a fall from the roof of the historic Belvedere Hotel. But the scene resisted simplicity. The distance from the main roof to the hole in the annex was significant. Investigators would later note that reaching that point would require either a running jump or a trajectory difficult to reconcile with a straightforward fall. According to structural assessments and reporting by outlets such as the Baltimore Sun, the physics of the incident did not align neatly with conventional expectations. Ray's glasses and cell phone were found near the hole. They appeared largely intact. Not shattered. Not significantly damaged. This detail, documented in investigative reports and later highlighted in true crime analyses, introduced immediate doubt. Objects subjected to a fall from such a height would typically show more visible impact. Inside the building, the silence lingered. There were no clear witnesses. No confirmed sightings of Ray entering the hotel that night. No security footage has been publicly released that could trace his final steps. The Belvedere, once grand and lively, now held a secret in its quiet corners. As investigators stood over the scene, the case began to divide into possibilities. An accident seemed unlikely. The option of ending his own life was considered, but it wasn't immediately supported by those who knew him. Behind the main investigation, a less obvious mystery started to emerge. Ray hadn't just fallen to his death. First, he had disappeared. This disappearance, in the days leading up to the discovery of his body, became the initial part of a mystery that remained unsolved. The central question shifted from how he died to why he was even at that location. Before his death, before the discovery of the hole in the roof, Ray seemed to have a well-organized and meaningful life. He intentionally moved to Baltimore from his home state of California. Those who knew him described Ray as a creative and ambitious person who valued his strong and supportive relationships. Ray worked as a writer, pursuing opportunities in film and financial publishing. At the time of his death, he was contributing to the Rebound Report, a newsletter affiliated with Stansberry and Associates, a financial research firm based in Baltimore. The company was founded by Porter Stansberry, a longtime friend of Ray's. According to publicly available information and interviews later referenced in investigative programs like Unsolved Mysteries, it was this friendship that took Ray across the country. That detail mattered, because it meant Ray was not isolated. He had arrived in Baltimore with trust already in place. At home, his life centered around his wife, Allison Rivera. Their relationship, by most accounts, was close and stable. Allison would later state that there were no clear signs of distress, no conversations suggesting Ray intended to leave or harm himself. They had plans. They had routines. They were building a future together. But beneath that surface, subtle shifts began to emerge. According to Allison and others interviewed during the investigation, Ray had recently expressed concerns about safety. He had installed an alarm system in their home. He reportedly reacted strongly to unexpected noises. These details, while not definitive, introduced a layer of unease that investigators would later revisit. There were also professional pressures. Working in financial publishing required precision, deadlines, and, at times, navigating controversial market opinions. While there is no official confirmation linking his work to any direct threat, the environment itself was not without tension. According to available reporting, Ray had also begun pursuing screenwriting more seriously, suggesting a man balancing multiple ambitions. Later, investigators would find the note hidden behind his computer. A long, cryptic document, filled with references to films, secret societies, and coded language. Its existence would cast a shadow backward over everything known about Ray's state of mind. At the time, however, none of this was visible. To his friends, Ray was engaged. To his wife, he was present. To colleagues, He was working. There were no obvious cracks. Let's go back to May 16, 2006. Nothing, at first, suggested it would be the last normal moment in Ray's life. He was at home with his wife, Allison, in their Baltimore residence. The day had passed without incident. There were no visible signs of distress. No arguments. No unusual behavior that would later stand out as a warning. According to Allison's account, the evening felt ordinary, quiet, and routine. Then the phone rang, and Ray answered. What happened in that brief exchange would never be fully confirmed. The call came through the switchboard of Stansberry and Associates, according to later reports. But the exact caller was never publicly identified. No recording. No transcript. After the call, Ray's demeanor changed immediately. According to Allison, he seemed surprised and in a hurry. He didn't say what they talked about. He left the house right away, quickly and suddenly, like he had to deal with something important immediately. He ran out the door. Ray got into his car and drove off into the Baltimore night. It would be the last confirmed sighting of Ray Rivera alive. From that point forward, the timeline begins to fracture. There were no confirmed witnesses placing him at the Belvedere Hotel. No verified footage has been publicly released that tracked his movements through the city. According to available investigative accounts, his car would later be found parked near the Belvedere, but even that discovery raised questions. The location was not where one would necessarily expect, and it did not provide a clear path explaining how Ray entered the building. In his house, small things now seemed important. His belongings were still there, his work and his plans. Nothing suggested he meant to be gone for long. He hadn't packed, left a note, or made any preparations to disappear. Just a phone call and a sudden departure. Allison later recalled that Ray didn't seem at all like she was saying goodbye forever. His voice and actions gave no indication that this was a final farewell or that anything was about to drastically change. Only urgency. As hours turned into a full night, then into the next day, concern began to grow. Calls went unanswered. Ray did not return home. He did not contact anyone. The silence deepened. And with it, a question that would haunt the investigation from the very beginning: what was said in that phone call? Because whatever Ray heard in those final moments was enough to pull him out of his home, into the dark, and toward a destination that, at least on the surface, made no sense. The investigation would soon begin. But already, something was wrong. This was not a man who simply vanished. He was called in. Ray didn't come home that night. Initially, it was easy to assume a reason for his absence, a meeting that ran late, an unplanned task. Something that would only delay him briefly. However, as time passed and the next day began, those explanations became less believable. Allison Rivera was out of town on a business trip. According to her later statements, she tried to reach Ray repeatedly. Each call went unanswered. No reply. No message. The silence was complete. By the second day, concern turned into alarm. Friends and colleagues were contacted. No one had seen him. No one had heard from him. There were no reports of Ray arriving at work, no indication he had followed through on any plans. The routine of his life had been abruptly interrupted, and no one could explain why. A missing persons report was filed with the Baltimore Police Department. The investigation began in fragments. Officers started with the last known moment, the phone call. According to the investigation, it had originated from the switchboard of Stansberry and Associates. But when detectives attempted to trace it further, they encountered resistance. The company, according to multiple reports, including later media investigations, did not cooperate beyond confirming the call came through their system. Employees were reportedly instructed not to speak with the police. That silence became its own kind of evidence. Without a clear caller, investigators were left with a void at the center of the timeline. A trigger with no source. A final moment that could not be reconstructed. Attention then shifted outward. Search efforts expanded across Baltimore. Police canvassed areas Ray was known to frequent. Posters were distributed. Friends and family organized their own searches, walking streets, checking parking lots, revisiting any place Ray might have gone. According to accounts later featured in Unsolved Mysteries, the effort was persistent. Ray vanished completely after leaving home. There were no signs of him, no one saw him, his credit cards and bank accounts weren't used, and there was no digital activity to indicate where he went. Days passed. Each passing day narrowed the window of possibility. Investigators began to consider scenarios beyond voluntary disappearance. An accident. Foul play. Something hidden. Then came a development that shifted the investigation. Ray's car was found. It was parked near the Belvedere Hotel. Not in a location that immediately drew attention, but close enough to introduce a new focal point. The discovery was significant. It anchored Ray to a physical place for the first time since he vanished. The Belvedere itself was a complex structure. Historic. Layered. With multiple access points, both public and private. According to investigators, determining how Ray might have entered, or where he had gone once inside, was not straightforward. Still, the search around the building did not immediately reveal anything. For several more days, nothing. Nobody. No clear evidence. Only the car, sitting quietly near a building that, at that point, held no visible answers. The investigation stalled in uncertainty. Until something changed. Something was watching from above. The Belvedere Hotel had already entered the investigation as a point of interest. Ray's car had been found nearby. Detectives had noted it, logged it, but without a body, without evidence inside the building, the connection remained incomplete. Then, on May 24, 2006, something drew attention upward. According to reports, employees noticed vultures circling and gathering near the rooftop of the Belvedere's annex. It was an unusual sight in downtown Baltimore. Persistent. Focused. Enough to raise concern. When the area was checked, the search moved inward. And there, inside a rarely used conference room beneath the annex roof, Ray Rivera was found. The discovery was immediate and deeply unsettling. There was a hole in the ceiling. Directly above where his body lay, the roof had been punctured from above, creating an opening that investigators believed marked the point of entry. It suggested a fall from height. But almost instantly, the physical realities of that fall began to resist explanation. The main roof of the Belvedere stood at a considerable distance from the location of the hole. According to structural assessments and reporting, including analysis cited by the Baltimore Sun, Ray would have had to travel a significant horizontal distance during the fall, far more than what would typically occur in a vertical drop. Investigators considered possible jump points. One theory suggested he may have run and leapt from the main roof. But even that raised questions. The required velocity, the trajectory, and the precision needed to reach that specific section of the annex roof, none of it aligned comfortably with a spontaneous act. Another possibility was a fall from a lower ledge. But access to such areas was limited, and no clear evidence confirmed that Ray had been there. Inside the room, more details complicated the picture. Ray's body showed signs of severe trauma consistent with a high fall. But according to the medical examiner's report, some injuries were described as unusual or not entirely consistent with the expected pattern. These findings would later contribute to the ruling of the cause of death as undetermined. His glasses and cell phone were found near the hole. Remarkably intact. Not destroyed. Not fragmented in a way typically associated with a fall from that height. This detail, noted in investigative records and later highlighted in multiple analyses, became one of the most debated elements of the case. Nearby, his flip-flops were also recovered. Broken, but not in a way that clearly matched the force of the impact below. Each piece of evidence seemed to tell a slightly different story, and none of them fully aligned. There were no confirmed witnesses placing Ray on the roof that night. No clear record of how he entered the building, no indication of forced access. The Belvedere, with its layered architecture and partial renovations, offered possibilities but no definitive answers. The scene suggested a fall, but not a simple one. Investigators now faced a new phase of the case, not a disappearance, but a reconstruction. A puzzle defined by physics, timing, and silence. The question was no longer where Ray Rivera was. It was how he got there, and whether he had been alone when he did. After the body was found, the investigation turned inward, back to Ray's home, back to the life he had left behind. It was there that investigators uncovered something unexpected. Behind Ray's computer, taped carefully to the back, was a note. It was not immediately visible. It had been folded, reduced in size, almost concealed. According to investigative reports and later coverage in Unsolved Mysteries, the note had been printed in extremely small font, so small it appeared intentionally compressed, as if meant to be hidden or overlooked. When unfolded, its contents raised more questions than answers. The text did not read like a conventional letter. It was not addressed to a specific person. It did not clearly explain the intent. Instead, it moved through a series of fragmented thoughts, references to films, celebrities, Freemasonry, and what appeared to be coded or symbolic language. Names appeared. Phrases repeated. There were lists, some seemingly random, others possibly structured with meaning not immediately understood. To investigators, the note introduced a new dimension to the case. Was this a personal manifesto? A piece of creative writing? Or evidence of a disturbed mental state? According to Allison, the note did not resemble anything Ray had previously written. She later stated that while Ray was creative and thoughtful, this document felt different, disconnected, unusual in tone and structure. The placement of the note also stood out. It was hidden. This duality created uncertainty. If Ray intended it to be found, why hide it? If he intended to keep it private, why not secure it more thoroughly? The note became a focal point in evaluating Ray's psychological condition in the days leading up to his disappearance. Some investigators considered whether it reflected paranoia or delusion. Certain passages referenced secret societies and hidden truths, language that could be interpreted as symbolic or as signs of something more concerning. However, no official diagnosis was ever confirmed. According to available records, Ray had not been formally evaluated for any severe mental health condition prior to his death. The ambiguity remained. Handwriting analysis was not applicable, it was typed. The document itself contained no direct admission, no explicit statement of intent. It neither confirmed nor denied the possibility of ending his life. Instead, it hovered in uncertainty. A message without a clear audience. A structure without a clear meaning. For some, the note suggested internal struggle. For others, it was simply the work of a writer, complex, abstract, unfinished. In this case, the focus changed. The investigation moved beyond just looking at physical evidence and timelines. It began to explore Ray's thoughts. However, this didn't make things clearer. Instead, it made the mystery even deeper. If the note was a clue, it was confusing because it suggested many possibilities, none of which were certain, and all of which were disturbing. The case, already complicated by strange events and unlikely physical occurrences, now had another confusing element. As the investigation progressed, the case became increasingly difficult to solve. They had the body, the place where it was found, and a timeline of what happened. However, these pieces didn't fit together to form a clear picture. Every answer they found only seemed to create more questions and inconsistencies. The medical examiner's report became a central point of tension. Ray's cause of death was not ruled as an end to his life, nor was it classified as a homicide. Instead, it was labeled undetermined. According to official records, this classification reflected the inconsistencies in both the physical evidence and the broader circumstances surrounding his death. The injuries were severe, consistent in part with a high fall, but not entirely conclusive. Some fractures, as noted in reports, did not clearly match the expected pattern. This ambiguity left the case suspended. How had Ray reached the roof? The Belvedere was not a simple structure. Access to certain areas, particularly the upper levels and ledges, was restricted. According to investigative accounts, there was no definitive evidence showing how Ray entered the building or navigated to a point from which such a fall could occur. No keycard logs publicly released. No witness placing him inside. The path remained invisible. Attention returned again to the phone call. It remained one of the most critical and most opaque elements of the case. The call had originated from the switchboard of Stansberry and Associates. Beyond that, the trail stopped. According to multiple reports, the company declined to cooperate further with police inquiries. Employees were advised not to speak with investigators. No caller was identified. No motive established. That silence carried weight. For some, it suggested nothing more than corporate caution. For others, it introduced the possibility that something relevant, perhaps crucial, remained undisclosed. However, no official findings ever confirmed wrongdoing by the company or its employees. The absence of cooperation remained just that, an absence. There were the objects found at the scene. The glasses. The phone. The flip-flops. Each item challenged expectations. Their condition did not fully match the violence of the fall. According to analyses referenced in investigative reporting and later documentaries, these inconsistencies became focal points for alternative theories. Some suggested staging. Others argued for unknown variables in the fall itself. None could be proven. Over time, theories began to diverge. One path leaned toward ending his life, supported, in part, by the cryptic note and the possibility of internal distress. Another pointed toward an accident, perhaps an attempt to access a restricted area that ended in a fatal misstep. A third, more speculative, raised the possibility of foul play, though no direct evidence confirmed it. Each theory held fragments of truth. The investigation slowed. Leads diminished. The case, once urgent, began to settle into a state familiar to unresolved mysteries, incomplete, contested, and quietly fading from official momentum. But for those closest to Ray, the questions did not fade. They remained sharp. Years passed, but the case did not settle. Ray Rivera's death remained suspended in uncertainty, never fully explained, never formally resolved. The official ruling of undetermined endured, a rare classification that reflected not just a lack of evidence, but a conflict within the evidence itself. For Alison Rivera, the absence of answers became its own form of permanence. She continued to speak publicly about the case, emphasizing what she believed investigators had not been able to reconcile. The trajectory of the fall. The condition of Ray's belongings. The unanswered questions surrounding the phone call. To her, these were not minor inconsistencies, they were fractures in the narrative that prevented closure. According to interviews and later coverage, including the 2020 revival of Unsolved Mysteries on Netflix, the case reached a new audience. Viewers were introduced to the details, the contradictions, the lingering sense that something essential had been missed. Public interest surged again, bringing renewed scrutiny to a case that had long remained in the shadows. But renewed attention did not bring resolution. No new witness came forward with definitive information. No previously hidden evidence emerged to clarify the sequence of events. The core questions remained unchanged. How did Ray reach the roof? What was said in the phone call? Why did the physical evidence not fully align with a simple fall? And perhaps most persistently, was Ray Rivera alone in those final moments? Authorities, bound by the available evidence, did not reopen the case as a criminal investigation. There was no official declaration of foul play. At the same time, there was no conclusion that could definitively explain his death as either the end of his life or an accident. The case remained in a narrow, unresolved space. Over time, it became more than a single incident. It became a reflection of the limits of investigation itself. Even with physical evidence, timelines, and analysis, some cases resist clarity, not because they lack data, but because the data does not agree. For the public, the case invites speculation. For the family, it remains personal. A life interrupted. A story without an ending. And beneath it all, a quiet, persistent truth: not every mystery fades with time. Some remain, unchanged, unanswered, and waiting. Because in the end, the case of Ray Rivera does not conclude. It lingers. In the space between what is known and what may never be.